All right, so again, good morning and welcome to the State Water Board staff workshop on the water unavailability methodology for the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta watershed. My name is Jessica Bean. I am the Assistant Director for the State Water Board's Office of Public Participation. And today, staff from the Division of Water Rights will provide an update on the current and forecasted watershed conditions for this critically dry year, and present an overview of the draft water unavailability methodology for the Delta watershed. As a result of the COVID-19 emergency and the governor's executive orders requiring social distancing, this workshop is being held remotely via Zoom. The workshop is also being webcast on the Cal EPA website, and both audio and video are being recorded. Those recordings will be made available on our drought webpage. The workshop today is being held in accordance with the public notice dated May 12th, 2021. This is an informal stakeholder workshop where a quorum of the State Water Board may be present, but the State Water Board will take no formal action. Next slide, please. So today's workshop is going to consist of two parts. First, we have a staff presentation, and then we're going to have an opportunity for public input. So the staff presentation will provide some context on the development of the methodology, as well as an overview of the proposed methodology and a demonstration of the water unavailability visualization tool. Following the staff presentation, we will have a public input portion of our workshop. And in order to successfully manage that, we have required all speakers to submit a virtual speaker card in advance of the workshop. So panel presentations will be limited to no more than 15 minutes, and public comments will be limited to no more than 5 minutes. And if needed, we may limit these times to accommodate all speakers. So again, after we have our staff presentation, we're going to move into the 3 panels that have requested to make presentations today. And then following the panels, we'll have an opportunity for the rest of our public commenters who submitted virtual speaker cards. I would like to remind all of the speakers today that oral comments should be limited to technical, factual, or legal matters related to the methodology. Staff will be taking notes and they may respond to clarifying questions. So please make sure to include any clarifying questions you have during your comment time. In terms of logistics, if you've already submitted a virtual speaker card, you should be in our Zoom meeting now. You would have been given a meeting ID and a password via email. If you have submitted a virtual speaker card and you have not received that meeting ID and password, please email bay-delta@waterboards.ca.gov. You can see that at the bottom of the screen as well on the slide. We currently have about 20 individuals who plan to make comments today, so that's something to be aware of. And as we approach lunchtime, we're going to make sure to find an appropriate point to pause so that we can take a lunch break. Before I turn things over to staff to begin their presentation, I do want to again remind everyone that this workshop is being recorded and webcast. So I would like to now invite Diane Riddle to introduce the staff presentation. Diane?
Thank you, Jessica. Do you hear me okay?
Yes, we do.
Okay, great. Again, my name is Diane Riddle. I'm one of the Assistant Deputy Directors in the Division of Water Rights with the State Water Board, overseeing the board's Bay Delta hearings and special projects branch. I would like to start by providing some context for the water unavailability analysis for the Delta watershed and the purpose, need, and intended use for the analysis. The Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta is critically important to the state's water supplies and the environment. Water supplies from the Delta provide a portion of the drinking water to 2/3 of Californians and millions of acres of farmland. The watershed is also home to numerous ecologically, economically, and culturally important fish and wildlife, many of which are threatened or endangered and depend on flows of an adequate quantity and quality for their survival. Water supplies in the Delta are also needed to repel salinity from the ocean from intruding upstream and making supplies from the Delta unusable. As you will hear more about in the next presentation from David Rizzardo, with Chief of the Department of Water Resources Hydrology Branch, we are currently experiencing extreme dry hydrologic conditions in the Delta watershed, creating current and expected future significant shortages in supplies to meet the multiple beneficial uses for water from the watershed. Conditions this year are projected to be the driest on record since 1977, following dry conditions in 2020. Significantly, projections for conditions degraded markedly between April and May, when expected runoff to the watershed decreased by nearly 800,000 acre-feet, which is nearly the total storage amount of Folsom Reservoir. This rapid degradation in expected water supplies has resulted in emergency water supply management conditions in the watershed. Due to these conditions, on May 10th, Governor Newsom declared a drought state of emergency for the Delta watershed. The proclamation directs the State Water Board and other agencies to consider a number of actions to protect water needed for health, safety, and the environment in the Delta watershed. The proclamation specifically directs the State Water Board to evaluate and take action to address conditions when water is not available at a water right holder's priority of right, including protection of previously stored releases of water that are not available to other users. Development of the methodology that is the subject of this workshop is the first step in that process. In the future, the State Water Board will also be considering development of emergency regulations to address issues of water unavailability. Any consideration of emergency regulations will include an additional public process with notice and opportunity for comment. Next slide, please. Issues related to water unavailability are part of the State Water Board's core responsibilities to administer the water right priority system in the state, as well as to provide for the reasonable protection of beneficial uses of water. Administering water right priorities is most critical during times of shortage to ensure that limited supplies are diverted in conformance with water right priorities. Because senior water right holders may be located downstream of junior water right holders, it is not always clear to users when supplies are not available at their priority of right. Similarly, it can be unclear when previously stored water is being released for a downstream purpose and as such is unavailable for diversion. In the Delta watershed, the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project, which I'll refer to collectively as the projects, are responsible for meeting flow and salinity requirements for the protection of beneficial uses in the Delta, as well as specific requirements for flows and water quality on project tributaries. During periods of shortage, these requirements are met in large part through storage releases. Specifically, previously stored water released by the project during the dry season serves a critical function to repel salinity from intruding into the Delta and making water unusable for municipal and agricultural purposes in much of the watershed, including in the Southern Delta, where municipal diversions occur for a significant portion of the state, as well as for agricultural purposes in the Delta and south of the Delta. If salinity were to intrude into the Delta, supplies from the Delta would not be usable for municipal and agricultural purposes. Once salinity intrudes into the Delta and into the channel soils, a significant amount of water is required to freshen the Delta, making salinity control and preservation of storage for salinity control a high priority. Maintaining adequate water in storage is also critical to ensuring water is available for environmental purposes, including temperature control and minimum in-stream flows. When water users divert previously stored water that they do not have a right to, they diminish the amount of water available to meet project obligations out of conformance with the water right priority system and to the detriment of maintaining storage for salinity control, environmental needs, and other project purposes. Currently, project reservoir storage levels are at or near historic lows, creating significant concerns for salinity control, municipal water supplies, temperature management, and other environmental needs. As such, it is critical that the project's storage supplies are protected. Next slide, please. To address issues of water unavailability, the State Water Board has developed a methodology for identifying when available data indicates that natural and abandoned water supplies are unavailable for direct diversion or diversion to storage for consumptive use by post-1914 appropriate water users in the Delta watershed. The methodology currently does not include detailed evaluations of water unavailability for pre-1914 appropriative or riparian claimants. The methodology is planned to be modified to address possible water unavailability by these senior claimants for possible future use in notices of water unavailability or for possible future emergency regulations. The methodology does not apply to rediversion of storage releases, water contract deliveries, or water transfers that are not subject to the same water right priority system. The methodology does not currently address water unavailability for non-consumptive uses of water like hydropower diversions, since these supplies are returned back to the stream. Though these diversions may change the timing of flows, generally from the wet season to the dry season. To the extent these changes result in abandoned flows, they are addressed in the methodology as will be described further in the staff presentation. The methodology is planned to be used to issue notices of water unavailability to water users. The methodology may also serve as a technical basis for future emergency curtailment regulations pursuant to the directives in the Governor's Emergency Drought Proclamation. Next slide, please. Given the severity of the current drought and the significant degradation in conditions, it is anticipated that water may be unavailable for diversion by all post-1914 appropriative right holders or nearly all post-1914 appropriative right holders as early as the first week in June. This will leave very limited time for staff to address comments before notices of water unavailability may be needed. Accordingly, I want to reiterate the importance of focusing your comments on significant issues that would affect the overall conclusions of the methodology and propose methods to address those issues that can be implemented in the near term. Next slide, please. To frame today's discussion, I wanted to provide a little more information about notices of water unavailability. More detailed information will also be provided at the State Water Board's June 1st board meeting and in future correspondence from the board. Notices of water unavailability are used to inform diverters that based on the best available information, there is insufficient water to meet water users' demands at their priority of right. Notices of water unavailability are not directives to stop diverting and are different from notices of curtailment that would occur as part of a possible future emergency regulation. Notices of water unavailability inform affected diverters that water is either currently unavailable or will be unavailable in the near future for their diversions. Notices of water unavailability play an important role by offering the opportunity for voluntary compliance prior to initiation of any formal enforcement action by the State Water Board. Diverting unavailable water can result in penalties for injury to more senior water right holders and public trust resources. Before the State Water Board takes any enforcement action related to notices of water unavailability, diverters would be noticed and afforded the opportunity for hearing. As occurred in the prior drought, we anticipate that water users will be interested in proposing possible voluntary agreements in response to notices of water unavailability. In order for any such agreement to be acceptable, they should include all affected water users and should be approved before being implemented. We also anticipate that there may be issues with notices of water unavailability and water supply needs for health and safety. Water users that may face these circumstances should be working to obtain alternate sources of water, including through voluntary transfers or purchases. When alternate sources are not available and there are true health and safety needs, those needs should be identified to the board as soon as possible so that the board can work with water users to address those issues. Next slide, please. That concludes my introduction to the methodology. I'll turn it over to David Rizzardo with DWR, who will provide more context related to the current hydrologic conditions. We will then begin the State Water Board staff presentation of the methodology with Jesse Jankowski. Mr. Rizzardo has a separate presentation. I believe that's being brought up now. And with that, I will turn it over to David.
Thank you, Diane. I'll wait for the slides to come up. And while that's happening, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is David Rizzardo. I am Chief of the Hydrology Branch for the Division of Flood Management within the California Department of Water Resources. It's an honor to be here and explain and give you some indication of like what we've seen this year and some of the challenges that have emerged as the spring has evolved. So some of the opening remarks I want to make before, I've just got 2 slides after this, but some of the opening remarks I want to make is make it really clear that what we're seeing, especially since April 1 this year, is hydrologic conditions, climate conditions that we've never seen before. In our shop, we're talking about this as an evolving situation that had otherwise seemed unheard of. So it's a clear indication that we're seeing results of climate change. And that's become more and more clear as the spring has evolved. And that's part of the overall message is this unprecedented hydrologic conditions. In fact, it's almost in the form of the climate change that we would expect to see later this century. And so that's one of the underlying worries is that we're seeing effects of climate change that were projected in the models at 2050 and beyond. The past 2 years, in particular this spring, we are seeing behaviors in the watershed in the Sierra Nevada that we, like I said, previously would have considered unheard of, and especially as it pertains to what I'll talk about here in a second, runoff efficiency. And I'll explain that with these 2 slides. One's going to talk about snowpack versus the actual runoff, and one will be a little longer look at precipitation deficit in the Sierra Nevada. So if we don't mind going to the next slide. So this will be a focus on the Feather River in particular. You can take this same story and project it into many of the watersheds in the Shasta Trinity all the way down to the Kern River throughout the Sierra Nevada. If you pull back to a statewide condition, on April 1, the statewide snowpack was the 20th driest since 1950. Not the first driest, not the 5th driest, the 20th driest. However, at that same time, the statewide water year-to-date rainfall, total precipitation on April 1, was one of the driest on record, dating back over 100 years. So this is a case of a single-year hydrologic anomaly where the snowpack was far more robust than the precipitation, which really, in hindsight, led to a false sense of how much water was really available for runoff. Much of that precipitation and snow came from the strong atmospheric rivers that we got in late January and early February. So in this slide, we have a case example for the Feather River watershed. On April 1st, the snow in the watershed was 71% of average. That ranks 31st out of the 71 years going back to 1950. In other words, not far from the middle of the pack. What you see here is a little deeper dive into how we look at things. So we kind of break the snow into a high elevation snow index and a low elevation snow index. And you see the ranking on April 1 for the high elevation was around 30 out of 92 in this case. And the low elevation 46. So again, nowhere near that bottom 1 through 10 even. And you see that the estimated volume from the snow water equivalent, that's how much water we think is in the snow, on April 1 was about 1.1 million acre feet. That's what that 1124 stands for. And the forecast at that time for the Feather River watershed reflected that, just over 1 million acre feet. That's the 1020 that you see in that chart. So in comparison, 71% of average snowpack in the Feather River on April 1. In comparison, 2015 was about 5% of average. That was the driest we'd ever seen. The 2 prior driest years that we had ever seen in snowpack were 1977 and 1991, both at 25% of average. So when 2015 evolved, the snowpack was just so far off the charts low, there was not much, it was an unprecedented situation. But we weren't looking at that this year by far. We were looking at much more robust snowpack compared to any of those 3 years I mentioned. So I'll call your attention to the two charts in the top left that have a bunch of dots and such. And those are scatter plots that correlate the high and low snow indices to the observed April-July runoff in the Feather River watershed. This is a tool that we can use and look at to help us understand if a forecast seems in the realm of possibilities. One of the best variables, in fact, the best variable to predict how much runoff is expected during an April-July period is snow water content. It's otherwise known as the amount of water contained in the snowpack. And again, as I mentioned earlier, on April 1, that estimate was just over 1.1 million acre feet. If you look at those two charts, you'll notice towards the very bottom, years 2014 and 2015 are called out, indicating both the record low snow and the record low runoff that was occurring during that time. The current water year, 2021, for the April 1 forecast is shown as a red triangle, a little bit higher up that diagonal line. And when you look at that, you see that it compares well. That forecast compares very well to the statistical best fit line, and more importantly, well within the scatter of those other dots. Those other dots represent all the other years in the record of what the snowpack was related to the forecasted runoff. So again, when we look at that, we go, okay, that forecast is well within the realm of possibilities. Makes sense to us. There's 1 million acre feet of snowpack sitting up there. We felt pretty good about that. When you look at what is possible for this year, you would have to drop that red triangle quite a bit straight down and well outside that scatter. So let me get back to that here. When you move forward to May 1st now, May 1st, the 1.1 million acre feet of snowpack runoff now is down to 139,000 acre feet. It shrunk by 88%. That's the snowmelt that we felt would feed into Lake Oroville. However, the actual amount of water that came into Oroville during that time was only 214,000 acre feet. So that equates to a 22% runoff efficiency. In other words, how much volume showed up compared to how much melted. And if you look back at those two scatter plots and you drop those red triangle down, like I said, to that 500,000 to 600,000 acre foot zone, which is where the forecast is now, you're looking at a forecast runoff that is well outside that realm of what was seen possible and what had happened in the past. These latest forecasts are now within the bottom 5 driest April-July runoff on record, which clashes statistically with where the snowpack was on April 1st. And again, it's just a good reminder that what we saw on April 1st is one thing. The puzzle pieces were saying 1 million acre feet or so. What actually happened was completely the opposite. It is important to also understand that we do know that there are losses each year into the system to percolation, evaporation, transpiration, and whatnot. These are all part of hydrologic parameters. But with the amount of snowpack we had, it really now highlights how dry these soils were and still currently are. And it's completely muted the runoff response in this year. And again, at levels we've never seen. Prior to this, we would have thought runoff efficiency on a really dry year was 65-75% of average, not 22. So this year is ranking as another year in recent times where we can say without a doubt that we're witnessing runoff or hydrologic responses that we've never seen historically. And more importantly, with the flip-flop back and forth from the extreme and massive extreme climate conditions, and also massive changes in the watershed. Within the last several years, we've had not just the North Complex fire this last year, but the Camp Fire a few years back, which further complicate the view. It's a change to the watershed, not only the soils, the vegetation, the tree canopy, a lot of things that really impact hydrologic runoff. So if we don't mind going to the next chart, this is a discussion here. These are charts highlighting this precipitation deficit. And this came about from an internal discussion on, we had this very severe drought that ended in 2016, 2015 being the worst, and then a little bit of recovery in 2016. 2017 was an extremely wet year, as we all know, as was 2019, pretty wet year. So the question was, did we actually ever recover during those wet years? Because the assumption after 2019 especially was, yeah, we've recovered. We've recovered soil-wise, soil deficit. We've recovered precip deficit. That's the assumption going into it, especially when you consider in the Northern Sierra, for example, in 2017, precipitation that year was just under 200% of average. It broke a record. So that's an easy assumption to make. But this is a graph looking back the last 10 years. And it starts with the assumption that following the wet year of 2011, our net deficit of precipitation, meaning that year to year, are you above average? Okay, you've got a surplus, and then if you go well below average, you've got a deficit. The assumption is after 2011 that we are at what we call net zero. There was no deficit, there was no surplus. And that may or may not be true, but it's it was a wet year, so we start with that assumption. And these are broken into the top two graphs, or the Northern Sierra. The center is our San Joaquin 5-station precip, which is kind of the Central Sierra. And then the bottom two are the Tulare Lake Basin 6-station precip index, which is kind of the Southern Sierra. So again, did we ever recover from that last drought? What you're looking at on the left is the departure from normal accumulation. So a statistical look is how far away. The shaded areas are sort of the average accumulation that you would have expected over that last decade. And then the lines indicate if we were departing from that, if we were not meeting that or we were exceeding it. And in all cases, you see the lines are below the shaded area. The more telling graphics are on the right side of the screen here, and I will start with the Northern Sierra. What you see through the progression there into 2015 and 2016 is a deficit of precipitation that reached about 60 inches. The average in the Northern Sierra on any given year of rainfall is 51 inches. So by 2015, at its worst, we were about a water year behind in precipitation. But you can see that rebounded at nearly 200% of average in 2017. It only rebounded us to net zero. It takes that kind of an extreme year to fill that bucket. And you see in 2019, we got slightly above average. And now these last 2 years, it's diving way off, where the current deficit is just about 40 inches. And again, the average is about 51. So to get back to net zero, if next year was a wet year, we would need another year at about 90 inches, similar to 2017, just to get back to zero, just to fill in that bucket. 2017 was 94.7 inches. What I also see in that trend is that the drop off from this last 2 years, 2020 and 21, in comparison to when the last drought started in 2012, this drop off is a little bit steeper than what we saw in 2012. And that tells me that recovery just never really fully happened. So if you move down to the San Joaquin watershed and then the Tulare Lake Basin watersheds, you see the situation's even more dire. The current deficit in the San Joaquin is 71 inches. This has never been lower, even in comparison to the 2015, the end of the 2015 drought. And equates to almost 2 years of rainfall deficit, given that the average in the San Joaquin is 40 inches. And it would take 110 inches just to get us back to net zero, or 273% of average, if that were to happen in 1 year. And of course, that's not going to happen in 1 year. That is unheard of. because the record in the San Joaquin is 77 inches. So we are going to need multiple back-to-back above average years to recover in the San Joaquin waters, Central Sierra, San Joaquin Basin. The story is even more dire as you move down to the Tulare Lake Basin region. The current deficit is far below what we saw at the end of 2015 at 67 inches, where the average annual precip in that basin is 28, almost 29 inches. So again, this is over 2 full years of deficit. Would need almost 100 inches, which is 340% of average, just to get back to net zero, with the wettest year on record in that region being about half that at 56 inches. Again, it's not going to happen in 1 year. It's going to take multiple years, to the point of almost 3 years, 3.5 years worth of rainfall on average, just to get back. This is the longest lasting effect of what's happening in the Sierra Nevada from our point of view. This deficit in precipitation. This is what stole the snowpack runoff, we believe, from reaching the reservoirs. We don't, in our shop, we don't necessarily have a good indication of soil moisture. That's still, for us, an evolving science and how to model that and how to consider that. But when you look at this, I think it's very clear that even though in the Northern Sierra, there was a return to net zero after 2017 and 2019, that doesn't necessarily mean that the soil recovered entirely. And again, this is not any information that we know for sure, but it's a speculation. But is the evidence there, in hindsight, again, being what it is? Absolutely. We all know that last year was record-breaking in terms of fires. The single largest fire, non-complex fire, happened in the San Joaquin Watershed last summer or last fall, the Creek Fire. The North Complex fire in the Feather River Watershed was not too far behind in amount of acreage. And then again, when you combine that with the lasting effects of the Camp Fire from a couple of years before, you have quite a bit of that watershed that has changed. And as I alluded to, the assumption is very clear. There is a soil moisture deficit that continues. And these changes to landscape, these changes from fire, these changes from these extremes are having a clear impact on runoff efficiency. So that is the conclusion of my slides. Diane, I don't know if I'm turning it back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. That was very informative. We will now turn it over to Jesse Jankowski, one of our water resources control engineers that would help to lead the effort to develop the water unavailability methodology. Jesse?
Thank you, Diane. Thank you, David, for the very important context. We're going to move back to our original slides, and I will begin discussing the technical details of the unavailability methodology for the Delta watershed. Next slide, please. So the methodology at its core is a comparison between water supplies and water demands from surface water using the best available data and multiple assumptions to modify them. Stream flows present in the Delta watershed may originate from multiple different sources. These include natural flows, which are runoff that is unaltered by diversion, storage, or other operations. Abandoned flows from in-stream dedications, agricultural runoff, or municipal water treatment plant releases without a residual claim of control. Imported supplies from outside the watershed, which may be considered foreign in source, or releases of previously stored water, which would be considered foreign in time in comparison to natural flows. The methodology attempts to account for both natural and abandoned flows and the water right demands which are charged against these water supplies, but it does not include imported supplies or storage releases which would not be available to water right diverters. Next slide, please. The methodology is also underpinned by the delineation of the Delta watershed into multiple, what we're referring to as sub-watersheds, each of which have their own associated water supply and demand data. The boundaries of these sub-watersheds are based on a one or more hydrologic unit code level 8 watersheds, or HUC-8s, as defined by the U.S. Geological Survey's watershed boundary data set. The headwater sub-watersheds, shown in blue in the map on the left, do not receive any tributary supplies from outside their boundaries, while the lower sub-watersheds, shown in green in the map, do have supplies that originate outside of their boundaries. They're located downstream of the headwater sub-watersheds. There are a total of 10 sub-watersheds, each within the Sacramento and San Joaquin River watersheds, which are outlined on the map. You can also see that the legal delta, as defined by the Delta Protection Act, spans areas in the furthest downstream portions of both watersheds. The methodology does not include any water supplies or demands from the Tulare Lake watershed, the Kings, Kern, Cahuilla, and Tule rivers. And it also excludes Panoche Creek, which is a small subwatershed in the southwest portion of the San Joaquin River watershed. The methodology at its core assumes that flow estimates, which are made at the yellow points shown in the map, represent all available water supplies that are meeting demands within each of these subwatersheds shown. Next slide, please. Supply data in this analysis for the methodology are assumed to be represented by full natural flow, also known as unimpaired flow. These data are computed values that account for observed stream flows with adjustments for upstream storage, diversions, and water imports, which attempt to estimate a theoretical water supply value, which is available for diversion by surface water right holders. The data in the methodology includes both past and forecasted supply estimates. The past values are made by water system operators and published collectively on the California Data Exchange Center, CDEC, as well as estimates made by the Department of Water Resources and the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration's California Nevada River Forecast Center, CNRFC. The CDEC estimates are largely for the major river systems in the Delta watershed, while CNRFC estimates include the smaller stream systems. While past data include single values that were observed and calculated, the forecasted supply values include multiple possible amounts of water, each of which have an associated probability. This accounts for the uncertainty of forecasting future conditions. And these are published in DWR's Bulletin 120 water supply forecast for major rivers, as well as there are forecasts by CNRFC for smaller streams. All supply data is on a monthly time step, which corresponds with the demand data that we'll discuss in a minute. And this was also assumed for the methodology to account for transit time within the Delta watershed system. Specific data sources for each of these sub-watersheds in the methodology are detailed in the report and the appendices. Next slide. There were cases, however, where data gaps exist, where either past data or data forecasts did not exist for certain stream systems. So two different what were called gap filling methods were utilized to estimate data to fill these gaps. The first of these techniques is referred to as extrapolation. So this was used where only a partial data set exists, and the result produced is a past or forecasted values for a given subwatershed to fill in these data gaps. This extrapolation was done based on hydrologic relationships with nearby watersheds that have more robust supply data available. It's essentially a linear regression for each month, which with y-intercepts forced to 0. The example shown here on the right is for the Bear River. The extrapolated values are shown in yellow, based on a relationship between the past data for the Bear River in light blue and the adjacent Yuba River watershed shown in dark blue. The result is water year 2015 to present and for
Folks, it looks like we may have lost Jesse for a second. We'll give an opportunity for Jesse to come back on, and then we can finish the presentation. So while we're waiting for Jesse to get back on here, are there any questions that folks have so far? If you'd like to raise your Zoom hand, if you do have a question, we can ask some staff to help with that. Looks like I'm not seeing any questions at this point.
So Jessica, can I suggest we maybe take a 5-minute break and we'll try to contact Jesse, and if he's unable to reconnect, we'll organize to see if we can have another staff person complete his portion of the presentation.
Yep, that's a great idea, Diane. So folks, why don't we take a 5-minute break? I have my clock at 9:47. Let's be back at 9:52 then, please. All right, folks, welcome back. Thanks for being patient with us as we deal with some technical difficulties. I think we have Jesse back with us now. So Jesse, would you like to continue?
Yes, thank you, Jessica.
Thank you so much.
Perfect timing on that. Okay, I'll resume with this slide. So the example shown here for extrapolation shows the Bear River extrapolated in yellow based on a past relationship with past data for the Bear shown in light blue with the Yuba River shown in dark blue. So again, it's essentially a linear regression by month with a y-intercept forced to 0. You can see the scatter plot on the left shows the correlation between these two data sets. Next slide, please. Great, that was where I dropped off last time. The other example of gap filling used in the methodology to estimate supply data is referred to as augmentation. So this was used to increase existing data to match all available water supplies. This might be necessary in the case of a subwatershed containing multiple small tributaries, and these forecasts only exist for a small number of those streams. They need to be increased to match all available supplies. The example shown on the right here is for Mill, Deer, and Butte Creeks in light blue, increased in the yellow line to produce forecasts that match DWR's estimates for the supplies of all Sacramento Valley East Side minor streams, which is shown in dark blue, based on a period of overlapping data, which is again shown in the red box. Similarly, this is also essentially a linear regression by month with a y-intercept forced to 0. Next slide, please. All right, we're staying online. For the purpose of the analysis, in addition to the natural flows shown through full natural flows previously, certain in-stream flows were identified in order to approximate abandoned flows that may also be available for diversion downstream of their dedicated reach. These flows are required under certain hydropower license conditions, state water board orders, or private agreements. And these were assumed to consist entirely of supplemental storage releases in the dry season rather than bypass of natural flows. These do not include any flow releases made to meet delta flow or water quality requirements, and they don't include other in-stream flow dedications which retain control dedicated for diversion downstream of their intended reach. The methodology assumes that these abandoned in-stream flow dedications accrue to the valley floor downstream of these individual subwatersheds in addition to full natural flow. These Sacramento watershed in-stream flows were obtained from the division's Sacramento Water Allocation Model, SACWAM. And I will note that the totals on this slide reflect the correct sum of the values corrected from the methodology report. Next slide, please. This shows abandoned in-stream flows assumed for a couple streams in the San Joaquin River watershed. which were obtained from the division's water supply effects model, the WSE. I will note that the methodology does not account for any of these abandoned in-stream flows being foreign in time or in source compared to natural flow. From here, we'll move to the next slide, and I will pass it over to my colleague, Mara Irby. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. Hi, I'm Mara Irby. I'm an environmental scientist in the board's Division of Water Rights. Jesse just went over the supply side of the methodology with you, and I'll be describing the demand side, as well as some adjustments that we've made to each data set. Water demand for the analysis is based on user-reported direct diversion and diversion to storage data from the State Water Board's electronic water rights information management system, which diverters report electronically to their monthly water diversion and use reported on an annual basis. For this methodology, we prepared both 2018 and 2019 data. Those years were selected because they're the most current years for which demand data is available, since reporting for the 2020 year is not due for some users until July 1st of this year. In addition, 2018 and 2019 are the only years since new diversion measurement and reporting requirements went into effect with Senate Bill 88 or SB 88. And although that's increased the frequency of reporting for some diverters, unfortunately, many diverters have not yet reached full compliance, such as through the installation of a measuring device, despite those deadlines having already passed. The methodology relies primarily on the 2018 data set because 2018 was a below normal water year in these regions of the state. 2019 was a wet year, so it's expected to be less representative of the current critically dry year. And 2018 may still underestimate actual demand for this year, given drier soil conditions and higher rates of evaporative loss and seepage. Next slide, please. So from these two years of data from the data set, that was further narrowed down based on several criteria. First, of course, being the location, since we're focused on the Delta watershed for this methodology. In addition, it focuses on active type status water rights, thereby excluding inactive statuses, such as inactive, revoked, and canceled rights that aren't expected to have demand this year. In addition, we selected for water right types appropriative and statements of water diversion and use. Between those two categories, you have post-1914 appropriative, labeled appropriative, and then statements includes pre-1914 appropriative rights and riparian rights. In doing so, we exclude smaller right types like registrations and stock ponds, which are assumed to have a negligible impact within the watershed on demand. And then lastly, we focus on consumptive beneficial uses. So any water rights that are exclusively non-consumptive, like certain hydropower generation facilities that return water diverted back to the stream source, which could then be diverted by other users, those records were excluded from the data set. After going through this process, there were about 11,700 total records remaining. Next slide, please. This map shows those records. You can get a sense for the distribution of them. Those in green are the post-1914 appropriative rights, of which there's about 5,000. And the purple are the pre-1914 and riparian claims. There's about 6,600 of those. And as I mentioned before, this data is self-reported by users, and it's not systematically verified for accuracy upon receipt. Therefore, it may contain inaccuracies and other errors. To address these issues, a quality control check was conducted. However, it was not feasible in the time we had to do that for all, approximately 12,000 records. Therefore, staff focused on those large diverters that have more of an impact on demand. So they looked at records that had a face value or reported diversion amount greater than or equal to 5,000 acre feet. That narrowed the data set for quality control to about 580 records, which is about 10% of diverters, but represents about 90% of the total water diverted in the Delta watershed. So through the quality control process, staff reviewed 2018 and 2019 annual reports for those records, and in some cases contacted diverters for additional information. They identified several types of data errors and corrected those as necessary. Those corrections included corrections to data entry and reporting, such as if someone used an incorrect unit of measurement or misplaced a decimal point. They also looked for duplicate reporting. So if someone reported, for example, under a riparian and a pre-1914, the exact same physical diversion, then those duplicates were removed to avoid inflating the demand values overall. In addition, they looked at where people reported more than the face value of their right, and in most cases limited the value to face value. And in addition to doing that for these diverters reporting or with a face value over 5,000 acre feet, they also identified approximately 100 post-1914 appropriative rights that also had reported greater than their face value and limited those in the face value. So after this quality control process, those quality controlled rights, as well as all the remainder that I haven't specifically mentioned, those were included in the data set. So the remaining ones went in without quality control, which is about 10% of water use, as I mentioned before. Next slide, please. So in order to be able to compare supply and demand values were aggregated at the same scale as supply, which is this sub-watershed scale that Justin described earlier. In some cases, a record had PODs in more than one sub-watershed. So we had to come up with a process for how to split those. And this was done based on the proportion of the points of diversion in each sub-watershed. So for example, if a right had 3 points of diversion, one of them being in the Sacramento Bend sub-watershed and 2 in the upper Sacramento Valley, then a third of the demand would be applied to the Sacramento Bend and 2/3 upper Sacramento Valley. In the future, if compliance with SB 88 improves, a more refined method might be possible for apportioning demand, such as if people measure and report water use at the POD, then we might be able to do that more directly. Next slide, please. The large water demands and unique operations of the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project warranted special consideration in the methodology. Most importantly, in recognition of area of origin protection, project diversions other than New Melones, which does not export water from the Delta watershed, were assumed to have the lowest priority date. And while some of the project diversions serve in-basin purposes that are not subject to area of origin protection, this summer, all of these uses are expected to be met with previously stored water due to the lack of significant inflow and other project obligations. These factors effectively result in curtailment of project water rights without any further action. And in addition to recognizing area of origin protection, the practice of assigning the most junior priority to the projects also helps to prevent any duplicate reporting between the projects and their various settlement contractors that have their own underlying water rights or claims of right from materially impacting the analysis. Most settlement contractors are assumed to divert pursuant to any senior water right they have first, if water is available in accordance with their water use reports, except for the Central Valley Project exchange contractors that receive CVP export supplies. The board plans to continue to coordinate with DWR and the Bureau of Reclamation and settlement contractors on the issue of water demands and priorities of Sacramento River and Feather River settlement contractors. In addition, the board will reevaluate the possibility for watershed-specific issues that may arise during the wet season related to these assumptions prior to its application beyond this current dry irrigation season. Next slide, please. Another point of special consideration within the methodology is the issue of InterBasing transfers. For example, the CBP Trinity River division demand has points of diversion in the Delta. However, this demand is met by imported water from the Trinity River. Therefore, those demand records are removed from the data set. In addition, diversions of full natural flow from the Yuba River as part of highly complex hydroelectric project operations for the Drum Spalding and Yuba Bear projects are planned to be removed from the Yuba River watershed's demand data set to represent that these flows are used outside of the Yuba River watershed, including any return flows and abandoned flows. Those adjustments are not yet incorporated, but are planned to be implemented prior to finalization of the methodology and issuance of notices of water unavailability. Next slide, please. Finally, the demand data set was adjusted to account for agricultural and municipal return flows by application of a return flow factor to reduce demand. In the 2014-2015 methodology that was used by the division in the last drought, a 40% return flow was used uniformly, and that was based on stakeholder input. But this year, that has been refined using modeling by Calcim 3, which accounts for return flow variation by location and time of year. Calcim 3 was selected because it's the most complete hydrologic simulation model for these watersheds. It includes simulations for the period of 1922 through 2015. And modeling for 2014 was selected for use in this methodology, given it being a recent year with hydrology most similar to the current year. Resulting from that, we had monthly return flows different for the Sacramento River watershed and the San Joaquin River watershed, which we then applied to 4 sub-watersheds, being the Sacramento Bend, Upper Sacramento Valley, Sacramento River Valley floor, and San Joaquin River Valley floor, where the majority of diversions and return flows in the watershed occur. This refined data set is then compared to the supplied data set that Jesse mentioned a moment ago. Next slide, please. Supply and demand are compared at 2 scales in the methodology, at a headwatershed scale and a watershed-wide scale, being either the Sacramento River watershed or the San Joaquin River watershed. As a result, diverters in the headwater subwatersheds have their water availability analyzed at both scales in order to assess both the physical availability of supplies to meet their demands and the relative priorities of their rights or claims as compared to those further downstream. This slide includes a schematic that illustrates the comparison of supply and demand within the headwater subwatersheds and how a portion of demand, which is shown in red at the top of the schematic, may be eliminated from the subsequent watershed-wide analysis if demand exceeds available supply in the headwater subwatershed. That will be more apparent in a moment when you see the visualizations. This eliminated demand is demand that cannot be physically met by available supplies, as there are no other sources of available supply for these subwatersheds, unlike the case for the downstream subwatersheds. These water right holders or claimants may receive a notice of water unavailability based on this analysis or the watershed-wide analysis. Removing demand that cannot be physically met in the headwaters enables a more accurate assessment of supplies available for downstream diversion. Next slide, please. The headwater subwatershed analysis also considers that there may be very dry conditions where the available supply cannot satisfy even all riparian and pre-1914 claimants. In this case, the headwater subwatershed is assumed to be disconnected from the watershed at large, and therefore both supply and demand are removed from these subwatersheds within the watershed-wide analysis. Next slide, please. The last adjustment to the data sets is the allocation of legal delta demands. Because diverters in the legal delta may have access to supplies from both the Sacramento and the San Joaquin watersheds, their demands have to be divided between these watersheds in order to enable analysis of these watersheds individually. The methodology makes this division based on a proration of total supply within each subwatershed. So for example, if the Sacramento River watershed generates 80% of the supply within the larger Delta watershed for a given month, 80% of legal Delta demand is charged against Sacramento River supply for that month, and 20% is charged against San Joaquin supply. I'll now hand the presentation over to Lisa Hong to demonstrate the visualization tool resulting from the analysis.
Great. Thank you, Mara. My name is Lisa Hong. I am a staff engineer in the Division of Water Rights, and I will be walking you through the visualization as well as the remaining of the staff presentation. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. So I think a natural question to any methodology or any process is, what is the end result? What do you get after applying the process, applying the methodology? And we have a visualization showing the result of applying the water unavailability methodology. So after going through the process that Jesse and Mara just described, we got the resultant supply and then we got the resulting demand. And we compare them on two levels. First, we compare them for headwater subwatersheds, and then we also do a comparison for the watersheds. And there are 3 tabs in the visualization that is available on the website. The first is a cover page showing how to use the visualization and a little bit about it. The 2 other tabs correspond to the 2 levels of comparisons that we make, and we will walk through each of them. So the first level of comparison that we do is for what we call headwater subwatershed. The purpose of this comparison is to avoid overestimating demand when we're examining the watershed as a whole. So the headwater subwatersheds are shown in green on the map for the Sacramento River Basin and shown in brown on a map for the San Joaquin River watershed. So these regions are the upstream regions in the Delta, meaning that they do not receive additional supply outside of their boundaries, and their regional demand can only really be met by the regional supply. And in the middle, we have a graph comparing the supply against the demand. The lines in the front represent the supply, the bars in the back represent demand. So the 4 lines that you see here are the 4 supply forecast scenarios. The yellow line is the highest supply forecast or the most optimistic forecast. And the supply decreases as the scenario gets more and more pessimistic. And the dark red line is the lowest forecast that we have. So 2021 is shaping out to be a very dry year, and the current supply is actually trending to be drier than even the driest forecast that is available. And in the back, we have the bars representing water demand. So on the bottom in dark blue, we have demands by riparian and pre-14 claimants, which are the most senior diverters. On top of that, in various shades of gray, we have demands by appropriative water right holders sorted by the decade of their priority. So as you go up the bar, the priority gets more and more junior. And then we also have demand by the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project stacked at the top. There are demands from 2 separate years that are available for 2018 and 2019. You can choose to toggle between the 2, but 2018 is shown as the default because it was the drier year. And you can click on any subwatershed that you're interested in to see local conditions. We'll do the Yuba subwatershed as an example. So you should be able to see the comparison between supply and demand for the Yuba subwatershed shown on your screen. So if we look at June, for example, the estimated supply for the red line is at about 20,000 acre feet. And the estimated demand for riparian and pre-14 claimants alone is about 27,000 acre feet. And that signals a supply shortage, and that water is likely to not be available for any diverters beyond 1914. You may also notice that there are a number of subwatersheds that are shown in gray on the map. These are the downstream regions in the delta, and they can receive inflow from outside their boundaries. So a direct comparison of supply and demand is not super informative. Instead, we will examine them as part of the watershed-wide analysis. We'll look at together. So the watershed analysis is essentially aggregating all the data at a sub-watershed level. And before we examine the condition in each watershed, as Mara mentioned, we also take 3 additional steps. So first, we remove any unmet demand in the headwater subwatersheds. In case that the subwatershed is deemed to be disconnected from the remaining of the watershed, we remove both supply and demand. And lastly, for the legal delta, we split the demand between the Sacramento River watershed and the San Joaquin watershed. And you can click on either of the watersheds to see their conditions. So you may notice that the layout and the graph looks very similar on this tab than the Headwater subwatershed tab. The only difference is that there is only 1 supply forecast line instead of 4. And that is because we used the 90% exceedance forecast to execute the 3 additional steps. And therefore, only the 90% exceedance line is shown here. So for folks who are not familiar with the term exceedance, 90% exceedance means that there is a 90% chance that the flow will be higher than the forecasted supply line. In most cases, that is a drier forecast. However, because 2021 is so dry that it's even drier than the driest forecast that is available, the 90% exceedance line is actually an optimistic view at the supply forecast in this particular case. So how can someone use this visualization, and how can average diverter get information from this visualization? There are 2 general use cases, one for diverters who are in the headwater subwatershed and one for someone in a lower subwatershed, and we'll walk through each of the use cases. So say, for example, if you're a diverter in one of the headwater subwatersheds, which are shown in green or shown in brown. For example, if we have a diverter who is located in the Sacramento Bend and with a priority date of 1925. So what you would do is you would click on the Sacramento Bend and see the regional water conditions. As you may notice, supply is actually much higher than demand in this subwatershed. However, there is a second step check. You would also go to the watershed analysis and click on the watershed you're in, which is Sacramento. And you may notice that the supply is actually not sufficient to be expected to be available for anyone beyond the priority year of 1919. So a diverter with a priority year of 1925 is actually not expected to have water to be available to them. And that is because by water law, junior diverters are required to leave flows in the stream in order for diversion by senior diverters downstream. So because of that, even though there is supply available in the Sacramento Bend area, a junior diverter is still required to bypass their flows. The second use case will be for a diverter who is located in the lower subwatershed, so one of the gray areas. And we'll say it is the same diverter, except for this time they're located in the Sacramento Valley floor and the same priority year of 1925. In this case, you will bypass the Headwater analysis entirely and go directly into the watershed analysis. And you will click on the watershed that you're in, and you'll be in the same scenario to find out that water is not expected to be available for someone with a priority date of 1925. So if you're in one of the Headwater subwatershed, it's a two-step check, whereas if you're in a lower subwatershed, it is a one-step check. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand the screen back to Courtney. And if Courtney, you can start on slide 28 in the presentation, that would be great. Great, thank you. So the data in this methodology will be updated, and the methodology will become the basis for issuing the notices of water unavailability. But before any notices get issued, we will update the monthly supply forecast to reflect the most recent month that we have. And we'll also be monitoring the daily supply forecast to check for any anticipated rain or storm events. And that will help inform which supply forecast line is closest to the current conditions, and therefore help inform when the notices will be issued and to whom. So given the current dry conditions, notices are expected to be issued as soon as early June. Next slide, please. There are also a number of planned refinements that have been underway since the release of the methodology on May 12th. So we are looking at verifying the assignment of large demands in their appropriate subwatersheds, refining abandon flow assumptions, exploring alternate supply forecast sources for a limited number of subwatersheds, and also considering the treatment of interbasin transfers. Any additional refinements beyond the ones that are currently underway will need to be balanced between the effects of these refinements on the end result and the ongoing urgent need to address the water supply shortage. Next slide, please. There are also a number of resources that are available for review and public comment on our website. You can find the link on the presentation page. We have a summary report and 2 technical appendices going over the assumptions and processes that you heard about today. And we have a methodology spreadsheet disclosing all the data that is being used to generate the result. And we also have the Tableau visualization tool on the webpage that we just walked through together today to show the result of applying the methodology. And with that, that concludes our staff presentation, and I am going to hand it over to Jessica.
Great, thanks, Lisa. If we can go to the next slide, please. Great, so I want to thank all of our presenters for walking us through this information. We're now going to hear from the 3 panels that have requested to make presentations today. Next slide. So in order to accommodate all of our participants, we are limiting presentations to 15 minutes. Again, we have 3 panels. We're going to go in the order that's listed on the screen here. So we'll first start with the Northern California Water Association and MBK engineers. And I understand that you do not have a presentation, but you're just going to speak. Is that correct?
Correct.
Great. All right. Well, you can go ahead and begin.
Right. Good morning. Thank you. I'm David Guy, Northern California Water Association, joined here with Mark Van Camp with MBK Engineers. Just want to first thank the State Water Board staff and the efforts that are being made. We appreciate the forward progress on this issue. Obviously, this is something that we've been working with your team on for a lot of years and trying to get the system and in a little bit better place. Obviously, that's a continuous process, and we just really appreciate the the forward progress that folks have made. So thank you for that. And we appreciate, obviously, you following the priority system. Obviously, that's, in our view, a very important way to do business, particularly in years like 2021. We have organized, obviously, in the Sacramento Valley, spent a lot of time thinking about these issues. We organize across the whole region, and that includes working with MBK and all of the managers throughout the region, so that we have a kind of a concerted process and effort, make sure that people understand the process. We have had a drought task force that has been meeting since December. And we've really appreciated having Sean McGuire and kind of his leadership in kind of thinking about these issues going forward. And then obviously having the participation of Eric Oppenheimer, Eric Ekdahl, and Connie Mitterhofer has been really valuable to that group and giving updates on kind of your process. So we've very much appreciated that. We also obviously spent a lot of time with your team, at least your predecessors in a lot of cases in 2014 and 15, and really learned a lot from that. And I think that's what Mark Van Camp here is going to focus on in a little bit here in a moment. But we've really appreciated kind of the forward progress since that time, and really encourage you to keep moving forward with this, working with folks like MBK engineers who really understand this system very well. Folks like Steve Gurnell does work with Yuba Water Agency that I think can really be a tremendous asset to your team to move this forward. So anyway, I'm going to transition this to Mark. I guess I would just encourage you to issue post-1914 curtailments as soon as you can. It sounds like you're looking at early June, but I think now is the time. I think folks are expecting them. And in fact, folks, I think would like to see the notice so that they can be planning for different things as we go forward. Obviously, the State Water Board sent a pretty sharp letter to the projects on April 30th. To both the DWR and the CVP. And I think in all fairness to those folks, I think you now need to follow through and kind of do what is in your purview. And that would include issuing post-14 curtailments as soon as you can. So anyway, I'm going to transition to Mark and let him offer some thoughts on kind of your technical work, and really appreciate the engagement that we've had with you all.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I want to echo David's thoughts. Greatly appreciate what the staff has done. You've come a long way since 2014 and 15. So I want to acknowledge a good job done. Of course, you also recognize you have a lot of work to do. We all do. Looking back through our comments from 2014 and 15, volumes of material, meetings, we have a submittal from June 27th from Mr. Andy Hitchings on behalf of NAQUA. I'd urge you to find that and review it. It has some information in it that might be helpful in your fine tuning of your tool. With the time we've had available, 10 days or so, I must say we haven't been able to dive into the details. We haven't compared what the report says as to what the spreadsheet does. Of course, we hope they compare closely, but we'll continue our efforts to look at those details. You've gone into a lot of details, which I appreciate. Some good work. We're willing to assist into the future. We'd like that assistance to come during a wet year, not a critical year as defined by D1641, but you know, we got to do what we can during these emergency time periods. Clearly what you have done and investigated on the abandoned water is a key issue in some watersheds. It may not be as critical for the watershed analysis wide approach. And so I appreciate the dual look at the upper watershed and the whole watershed, which is appropriate. The abandoned water issue may adjust the timing at a given watershed, but may not affect the whole watershed. So it is a difficult issue, a lot of details there. I do want to recognize how in several cases what you've done, and I think is appropriate, is maybe on the low side of the demand estimate, and in some cases on the high side of the supply. which is good to be not prematurely curtailing water rights. With all that said, all the details, all the future work, as David indicated, we do support the curtailment of post-14 water rights in June of 2021 for the Sacramento River watershed. I say that based on our high-level review of just the available natural flow, the demands of the pre-14 and riparian folks. And we also look at that compared to 2015, when the curtailment of all post-14 was May 1. That is also supported by what we're seeing, as David indicated, from folks on the ground in various watersheds in the Sacramento Valley. I'd also say it's consistent with the approach, the analysis that was done in the 1956 studies that were used pursuant to D990 to arrive at the Sac River settlement contracts. Those deficiencies are why people entered those contracts, along with the Feather River system, other locations in the Delta, including the Delta. So moving forward, a couple suggestions. We heard the issues with the water supply forecast. Clearly, you should take a hard look at the difference between 2015 and 21. Possibly take a hard look at your hindsight, the forecast, the water supply forecast. In some cases, you're using Bulletin 120. Some of the folks in the Sac River watershed prefer and believe the River Forecast Center is much more accurate. I'd like to look back in hindsight and see how those differed this year, say in March, April, and May of this year. So we won't be as surprised, maybe. But improvements there will obviously be helpful for all of us. As David indicated, early announcement of these curtailments is critically important for those that don't have the backup supply. We would really like you to investigate how you have split the demand, apportion the demand in the Delta to the various watersheds. You've done it on a prorated basis based on inflow. This seems contrary to decision, your State Board Order 89-8. We'd ask that you investigate that as you move forward with this tool. And clearly, moving forward with your tool, to get further into the priority system, you're going to need to look at the riparian demands and the pre-14 demands by priority, including the potential of the Delta storage concept, which you may hear from others on that. Overall, I think you've done a great job. I want to, applaud you for the effort. We have more work to do, but we do believe it supports the curtailment here in 2021. David, do you have anything to add?
No, thank you, Mark. Thank you, State Water Board folks, for the opportunity.
Great, thank you so much. We appreciate your feedback. Let's see, let's move on to our next presentation. Is going to be from Oakdale Irrigation District and South San Joaquin Irrigation District. If you want to go ahead and come on and start your presentation, we have your slides up.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, Tim, this is Ken Robbins. Let me just simply say that I'm here as well. Tim and I have coordinated. Tim's doing the presentation, but I'll be available for questions if necessary.
Thank you so much, Ken.
So want to start out with some general comments first. One is we're working very hard right now in the San Joaquin River Basin. We hope to get in front of the State Water Resources Control Board agreements about how water is going to be used in the San Joaquin River Basin this summer and into fall. Where it's very similar to a letter that we sent to the State Water Resources Control Board in 2015. The goal is to try to get roughly 90% of the water in the San Joaquin River Basin accounted for in that agreement, and we hope to present that to you soon. On another good note, it was interesting listening to the discussion on Tuesday in front of the State Water Resources Control Board. You will find this kind of ironic. We agree with the comments made by Gary Bobker, Doug Obici et al. In regards to the water quality control plan. And in that regard, what I think we need to really sit down and be honest about and have a good discussion on in the water quality control plans is an issue we've raised since 1995, up and through phase 1, and I'm assuming going into phase 2, which is when we have these critical year periods, they're not, while this one is in the top 2 or 3, they're not unexpected. In a water quality control plan, we should plan for and understand that these are going to occur, and we should know what the rules of the game are going in. And I understand the consternation both on what I would call the NGO side of the aisle and what's happening to the environment. And conversely, I understand it from the M&I side and the agricultural side of what's happening to their supplies. But if you know and can plan for ahead of time what the rules of the game and engagement are going to be, then you can hopefully build in the resiliency ahead of time so that we're not running around like we were in 2014, 2015, and as we are this year. So I think it's really important that the state board, as part of its water quality control planning process, take into account that these critical years are going to occur, take into account droughts are going to occur, and take into account that climate change is here. And we really need to understand what the impacts of making rules that we're not going to meet as part of our analysis when there's no expectation that they will be done. And I think that's what causes the angst, the impacts and the consternation about what we're doing in water years like this. I want to echo Mark Van Camp. I think your staff's done a good job moving forward from 2014, 2015. The only thing I would say, and I said this in a previous discussion with your staff earlier this week, is that we dropped the ball in 2014 and 2015. Coming out of that, we were clearly poised to sit down, meet, and really start working through these issues with your staff. That didn't happen. I realize your staff has been working on this, but unfortunately, we have this disconnect again where staff is working on something, you don't have the input from the stakeholders, and there's a disconnect. And what you're going to hear now is comments on the disconnect. I think a lot of these issues can be addressed. Some of them are going to be policy calls. Some of them are going to be legal calls that we'll have to deal with later and go through it. So with that, comments. Stanislaus River. So we're going to start upstream and work downstream. F&F is a good starting point for an analysis. Don't disagree with it. The numbers seem to be better. They're more refined from 2014, 2015. So that's a good start. The problem is when you're looking at a system, F&F is just the starting point and it's not the ending point. And so in the Stanislaus River, you have an adjudicated water basin which entitles the districts to the first 1816.6 CFS from the river. So if the districts are taking, if it's the summertime this year and the supply side of the F&F is correct, all the F&F water is being diverted. The districts have no requirements to release downstream, in-stream flow water or any regulatory water at all. Those requirements are put on reclamation. Reclamation, as a junior water right holder, is releasing stored water from New Melones to meet its in-stream flow obligations under D1422, its OCAP BO obligations, and its D1641 obligations. So the water that is available has to be associated to a water right. So on the Stanislaus River, when water is released, it's all stored water. And it has been probably since the first of the month. So if reclamation is releasing stored water to meet these requirements, then water moving downstream is available once it meets its compliance point, and that's at Vernalis. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so Vernalis is where reclamation's water reaches. Under D1641, they're required to meet TDS at Vernalis. Now, I did this on the understanding that TDS is a year-round requirement at Vernalis. There are water quality flow requirements at Vernalis for February through June, with which reclamation is required to meet under D1641 as well. Those flows, however, when they do meet the requirements at Vernalis, are abandoned. They are not subject to appropriation. And in fact, it's very clear that the water at Vernalis, when it meets those requirements, is water subject to availability. It has been that way since New Melones has been built. When you look at how the projects operate, that water that previously has been made available for those requirements is split between DWR and reclamation, because reclamation has no ability to redivert that water. One curious thing is happening this year. Ernest Conant, Mid-Pacific Regional Director, mentioned it to you in his presentation the other day at the State Board on Tuesday. He stated that reclamation was working outside the box. Water is being released from New Melones right now to meet Delta outflow requirements. This is an illegal act by reclamation. It's in violation of the authorizing legislation for New Melones. It's in violation of the Secretary of Interior's determination for New Melones. It's in violation of their water right permits. There is no Delta outflow requirement for releases of water from New Melones. New Melones is not part of the COA. So what's happening right now is water is being released by reclamation to maintain storage somewhat in Shasta, but mainly in Orville, to the benefit of the state water project contractors and DWR. This provides no benefit to New Melones. There's no refill criteria projected for New Melones. There's no ability to repay that water to New Melones, and that is to the detriment of the stakeholders in the Stanislaus River Basin. Next slide, please. Delta demand. Talk to your staff extensively about this earlier this week. This is the same problem we've had previously. So I'm going to go back and go upstream to, and you don't need to change the slide, to talk briefly about Vernalis. So on the Stanislaus River, depending, the current methodology that's being used is if FNF is available, it's moved downstream into the lower San Joaquin River pod. This is also true on the Tuolumne and on the Merced, and it's true in regards to return flows, water treatment flows, and accretions. I think it's safe to say this year, based on the water rights that are held on the Tuolumne and the Merced, based on the return flows to the river, that pretty much any water showing up, not pretty much, but any water showing up at Vernalis right now is previously stored water. So if water showing up at Vernalis is previously stored water, then it's not available to riparians. So what's happening here is kind of a disconnect again. There's an assignment of demand in the Delta to riparians. And I'm not talking the whole Delta. Because the San Joaquin River flows do not go to Freeport, and Freeport flows do not go to Vernalis. So if you look specifically on as how the state board has done this for the last almost 100 years, San Joaquin River flows are Old River, Middle River, and Main Stem San Joaquin. The inflow to those systems comes from the San Joaquin River at Vernalis, the Calaveras, and the McCollum. So entities downstream of that are entitled to the benefit of that water when it hits the Delta. I have no doubt, because I hired Susan Paulson. It was part of the California Water Fix proceedings. DWR did modeling on this as well. I agree that there's a residual of riparian water in the Delta at any time, but clearly in a year like this year, where the inflows are going to be so low and all the inflows are from stored water, that pool of riparian water in the Delta is questionable, and the duration of it is questionable. So I think what needs to happen is we definitely need to sit down and look at what is the water that is coming in at Vernalis to the Delta, and what is the demand in the Delta for that water. Because in actuality, which is a little bit different than the Sacramento side, on the San Joaquin side, if all the water being released is stored water and is being abandoned on the Merced, the Tuolumne, and the Stanislaus system, downstream appropriators under their post-14 water rights would have access to that water. So you may have a situation where you have water demand in the San Joaquin River Basin that would support post-14 water rights, which is different than in the Sacramento Basin. Finally, on the last comment on the assessment of water, I do agree with the report that it is a generous assessment of water availability in the Delta, and we need to work on that further. Last slide. So we've already talked about the riparian issue. Real quickly on the priority of rights. So in 2014, 2015, the San Joaquin Valley worked very hard. And I think we have to understand that water rights in California are self-policing. If your neighbor is taking your riparian water, you hopefully walk next door and tell them that you have to have a correlative share, and you work those issues out. So on the San Joaquin side, I think there were 3 complaints in 2015 in the entire San Joaquin River Basin regarding water. We're looking to, with our agreement, hopefully capture 90% of the water, if not more, for this year, and ensure that there are no disputes in the San Joaquin River Basin and that the water right priority system is respected. We're also looking to see if we can make some additional water available for San Joaquin River flows and in Delta flows. And we hope to get that to you early next week. But when I look at this, issue, and I wrote the last bullet point that this is a Delta problem, really, as described on Tuesday and today, this is really a Sacramento River Delta problem. I realize the goal is to push water up into Shasta, Oroville, the Yuba, in Folsom. I just rode by Folsom yesterday. It's very depressing to look at. There's a problem there, but the problem is that the San Joaquin River flows, or curtailing San Joaquin River flows, our use of water in the San Joaquin River is not going to put water into those reservoirs. And the reason I say that is this. So I asked your staff in our phone call, if we're going to do a curtailment in the San Joaquin River Basin this year, then we need to look at what is it we hope to achieve. And so if you're looking to push water up into the reservoirs in the Sacramento River system, you have to push additional water into the Delta. In 2014 and 2015, when the curtailments were done, if you go back and you look at the data, no additional water was made available in the Delta. And in fact, the Delta supply numbers that staff came up with at that time were relatively right and were relatively unchanged. And I asked your staff again earlier this week about that issue. And I asked them, what is the Delta difference between implementing curtailments on the San Joaquin River Basin and the current operations that are currently in place in the San Joaquin River Basin? And your staff didn't have an answer because for a variety of reasons, but they didn't have an answer. So saying that we're going to curtail something and go through this process of water right enforcement, an order, and depending on who's being affected, the litigation that we went through back in 2015, if we're not going to get a result at Vernalis or in the Delta that's going to support the goal of pushing more water upstream into the reservoirs or maintaining what I'm going to assume are the TUCP projected flows, then there's no sense in doing it. So we would respectfully request that no curtailments be issued in the San Joaquin River Basin. And we will submit our letter, hopefully shortly next week, on our voluntary agreements for your consideration. And thank you for your time. And I don't know if you have any questions of me.
Thanks, Tim. If you could just give us one moment, we're conferring.
Sure.
I think we can follow up with Tim. I'm following your comments. I think what would be really helpful is to receive your comments in writing so that we can go through those in a little bit more detail. We're going to have to look into this abandoned flow assumption, as I mentioned to you in our meeting earlier. And I think that relates to some of the other comments that you also made. But if you want to provide your comments in writing, that will really help us to navigate through them and assess, what our conclusions are related to those arguments.
Absolutely. And like I said in that conversation, I realize that we're under this short time period, and we're going to get our comments in. We'll get our voluntary agreement in next week. But the other thing I think, and I just asked not only the staff, but I really asked the state board this, which is that as we move through this problem, and we're all working really hard right now to get through this, but that after this water year is over, that we continue the work necessary to make sure that we resolve a lot of these issues. And it, like we talked about earlier, if there's policy or legal issues we can't resolve, we need to tee those up so people know what they are, and we can work on a methodology to get them resolved. So we're willing in the San Joaquin River Basin to do that. So thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate that. I think we're all in the same boat, and we have not been working for years on this methodology. It's come together pretty quickly. So we do appreciate the feedback and the input, and particularly targeted feedback that we can use in the next couple of weeks, honestly, to make necessary adjustments. And I understand where you're coming from with the proposal for a voluntary agreement, and we can take a look at that in more detail and the legal basis for how you've arrived at that voluntary agreement.
Thank you very much.
Great. All right, let's move on to our final panel. It's the state water contractors. So the presenters in that group, if you'd like to come on off of mute, your presentation is ready to go.
Good morning. My name is Chandra Chilmakuri. I'm the Assistant General Manager for State Water Contractors. I'm here with my colleagues from 3 State Water Project public water agencies: Craig Wallace from Kern County Water Agency, Brad Coffey from Metropolitan Water District, and Cindy Gao with Santa Clara Valley Water District. We are here today to highlight the importance of protecting stored water and to support the board in implementing effective and efficient water unavailability approach. We'd like to start off briefly. If you can skip to the next slide, please. We would like to start off briefly by summarizing the proactive actions taken by the State Water Project and its contractors to conserve stored water this year to help manage through the current drought. As Director Nimit described on Tuesday, water year 2020 and 2021 are the driest 2-year period since 1977. Even though we received healthy snowfall this year, it did not materialize in runoff, as you have heard from Dave Rizzardo earlier today. State Water Project had made substantial improvements based on the experience from the last drought. For example, State Water Project agreed to revise sharing formulae under the Coordinated Operations Agreement with CVP, recognizing the difficulties with Shasta temperature management during the last drought. Since 2019, State Water Project also increased the end-of-year Orwell storage operating target to 1.6 million acre-feet, an increase of up to 300,000 acre-feet. This change allowed State Water Project to conserve storage in Orwell instead of delivering it to the State Water Project contractors, and to be better prepared for dry year needs. In addition, Department of Water Resources did not rely on the stored water in Orwell to support the low 20% allocation for its contractors last year and conserved upstream storage. This year, water supply allocations to State Water Project contractors were kept at historical low of 5%, only the second time in the history of the State Water Project. Once again, Department of Water Resources did not rely on stored water in Oroville to meet the allocations to conserve upstream storage. State Water Project has also started drought contingency planning early as required under the 2020 incidental take permit and frequently has been updating this plan. There's no question that State Water Project has taken several proactive actions to conserve upstream storage coming into this drought. Now, it is critical that stored water releases are protected for intended uses. Next, I'll turn it over to my colleagues, starting with Craig Wallace, who will briefly describe the actions taken by the State Water Project contractors in planning for and managing through this drought.
Thanks, Chandra. My name is Craig Wallace, and I am the State Water Project Manager for Kern County Water Agency. Next slide, please. Ag in Kern County specifically have made significant investments in infrastructure and technology that provides for efficient and flexible movement of water. Kern County growers are world leaders in groundwater banking, having invested hundreds of millions of dollars to build its groundwater banking infrastructure. The banks can store upwards of 5.7 million acre feet of water to recharge or store during wet years, and through pumping, extract water for use during dry years. Previously stored water from banking projects has been crucial to the area's survival during drought cycles and low State Water Project allocations like we are experiencing this year. Water agencies and growers in Kern County have planned for dry years and droughts. Our growers employ the most advanced water conservation techniques, including micro-drip irrigation. Many growers have invested in technologies or scheduling services to optimize irrigation practices. The past several years have seen growers redeveloping land by taking permanent crops out of service or planting crops that require less water. Next slide, please. However, even with all this past and current investment, that still hasn't shielded growers from having to fallow land or look for limited available transfer supplies that can cost upwards of $1,000 per acre foot. In years with such low allocations, operational exchanges to recover banked water can be challenging. Numerous water agencies and districts throughout the state have previously banked water in Kern County for water years exactly like this one. To recover that banked water, there needs to be sufficient demand downstreams of Kern County to match the water withdrawn from the banks. We are working closely with the Department of Water Resources to efficiently manage operations this year. I'll now hand it over to Brad Coffey from Metropolitan Water District.
Thank you. My name is Brad Coffey, and I serve as the Water Resource Manager for Metropolitan Water District. Next slide, please. Metropolitan is managing through this drought by operating in unprecedented ways while promoting conservation and local supply development. Lessons from the last drought spurred us towards policy and infrastructure innovations that are being realized today. Next slide, please. First, we strongly support conservation. Recent examples include doubling of the turf rebates and starting a new $250 replacement rebate on toilets in older multifamily housing. The toilet rebate helps disadvantaged communities make water conservation more affordable. Our region-wide drought messaging emphasizes that water saved today helps us both now and next year, especially if this drought persists. Next slide, please. The State Water Project remains critical to our overall supply because a portion of our service area relies on it exclusively. In normal and dry years, we can move water back and forth between the Colorado River and the State Water Project to balance multiple water quality and supply objectives. Next slide, please. But at a 5% allocation, nearly unthinkable a decade ago. I'm sorry, next slide, please. The 5% allocation, nearly unthinkable a decade ago, pushed us beyond the envelope of our existing system. That's why we spent more than $45 million to change how we receive State Water Project supplies. Here's an example. By partnering with Department of Water Resources to repurpose one of their pipelines, We now feed 150 million gallons per day water treatment plant in Riverside County from stored water in Diamond Valley Lake. Previously, this plant could only receive state project water directly. Beyond pipes and pumps, we've also innovated on policy by removing a major financial barrier to some of our agencies who can now shift onto Colorado River water. Finally, Metropolitan is helping Department of Water Resources facilitate water exchanges to support deliveries to areas in greatest need during this drought emergency. Without the 5% allocation in place, this flexibility to move banked groundwater could not take place. By promoting conservation, spurring local supply development, stretching our distribution system, and responsibly drafting storage, Metropolitan can manage the drought through this drought for the region. Now I'll turn it over to Cindy Cowell of Santa Clara Valley Water District.
Hi, this is Cindy Gaw with the Santa Clara Valley Water District. I'm wondering if the slides are able to be advanced because on my screen, here they go. Okay, thanks. Cindy Gaw, Santa Clara Valley Water District. We serve 2 million people, Silicon Valley, and we are very dependent on imported supplies. Next slide, please. One of our biggest challenges is that our largest reservoir, Anderson, was drained last year due to a FERC order. This results in a significant loss of local supply and emergency storage and significantly impairs our water supply reliability moving forward. Anderson will remain drained for 10 years. This results in us being even more dependent on our SWP and CVP supplies. Zone 7, by the way, that is not a photo of me up there. Looks like my video isn't showing. Zone 7 and Alameda County, as well as Valley Water, rely on minimum export pumping from the Delta this year to meet our critical needs. Our agencies take our state water project deliveries directly from the Delta down the South Bay Aqueduct. So continuing that minimal pumping is essential in order for us to meet our treatment plant demands. That minimum pumping is also needed to bring back previously banked supplies in semi-tropic that we need to supplement our low allocations this year. I also want to emphasize the importance of water transfers. The low allocations this year provide insufficient water to meet our needs. So water transfers are essential. Many of these transfers will be held in project storage reservoirs until the fall, which will help protect cold water pool for salmon as well as meet critical urban needs. And I'd say that the majority of those transfers are being held back and will provide that dual benefit. But they don't help meet needs prior to that time. So, most of the year, those transfers are not going to be available. And we will be dependent on our already low state water project and CVP allocations. So continued delivery of those supplies and the quantity of those supplies is really essential for us to get through this year. So transfers cannot compensate fully for any reduction in our SWP and CVP supplies, but they are needed to augment and provide some level of sustainability for next year if the drought continues. We'd be very supportive of an approach in the state board methodology that protects transfers. Next slide, please. So Valley Water has taken seriously the importance of conservation and regional self-reliance. Since the last drought, we've been consistently promoting 20% water use reduction. In last month, we set an aggressive target of 25% water use reduction. We also recommended permanent wastewater prohibitions. We doubled our incentives for landscape conversion. We're expanding our conservation messaging as well as our conservation programs. We have a lot of information on this on our website. We've also made significant investments in development of sustainable local supplies. We have a purification center that is currently producing 9,000 acre feet per year. We are aggressively pursuing development of another 11,000 acre feet per year of indirect potable reuse. We're working to expand our recycled water production to 24,000 acre feet. We want more of all of that. We've been trying to secure the maximum amount of recycled water and purified water that we can, although these projects are very challenging to move forward. We can't do them by ourselves. We need partners. There are political, technical, financial barriers that we are working hard to overcome. We are also very focused on improving our storage capabilities and are working to develop local surface storage, as many of you may know, as well as new groundwater banking opportunities. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Chandra.
Thank you, Cindy. If you advance to the next slide, please. As you have heard, state water project contractors are taking proactive measures to manage through the year and prepare for another potential dry year. We agree with State Water Board staff that it is critical that previously stored water is protected for intended downstream uses. We appreciate that the board staff recognize the water unavailability analysis does not apply to redivision of the state water project stored water. As you heard from our members, the promised allocations are really critical for continuing serving their needs this year. As described earlier, stored water supports cold water pool for temperature management and managing water transfers. It is critical that releases for water transfers are protected in addition to the stored water releases. Next slide, please. State water project stored water releases are for the purpose of complying with regulatory requirements for water deliveries to the state water project contractors. Water users without a contract do not have right to these previously stored supplies. As reported by Director Namath, there is a significant increase in depletions this year, raising a concern that stored water releases are being diverted prior to meeting the intended regulatory compliance needs. Next slide, please. So why is it important to protect stored water releases? If the stored water releases are not protected, it will be difficult to meet the water quality control plan requirements in the Delta. Upstream storage will be further depleted to meet those requirements, impacting upstream temperature management. Potentially high salinity conditions could remain in the Delta for many months before it could be flushed out. To demonstrate this, two salinity contour maps are shown here. Modeled Delta salinity conditions estimated for July 11, 2015 are shown on the left, and salinity conditions for the same day if State Water Project and CVP stored water releases were not present on the right. Blues are the fresher salinities with values less than 2000 microsiemens per centimeters. Yellows and reds are higher salinities, with reds showing values up to 30,000 microsiemens per centimeters. This is just to illustrate how critical it is to protect the stored water releases to meet its intended purposes. Next slide, please. We appreciate Water Board's initiatives to improve data and tools to manage water unavailability. We have a few recommendations for effective and efficient water management or management of water unavailability. As the data and tools are improved, we recommend that the board's methodology should be validated. Water Board should encourage voluntary curtailments, but with monitoring and reporting to show reduced diversions. Water Board should encourage water transfers and other creative ideas to allow stretching the limited water to provide multiple benefits. We recommend Water Board to strictly enforce measurement and reporting requirements on all water diverters, as improved data will help with improved management. We are currently reviewing the methodology and expect to provide additional written comments. We'll close off by re-emphasizing that protecting State Water Project and CVP stored water is critical for drought management in California, and we are available to support the board staff with this effort. Thank you for your time.
Great, thank you so much. So that brings us to an end of our panels. We had 3 panels. I think we're going to go ahead and take an early lunch now before we jump into the individual comments. So we're going to take a 30-minute lunch. So we'd like everyone to be back here to begin the individual public comments at 11:40, please. All right, folks, welcome back. Hope you were able to have a nice lunch. The next thing we're going to move into is our individual public comment period. Thank you. Okay, so we're now going to hear from about 18 individuals who submitted the online form that was required for folks to speak today. So again, in order to accommodate all of our participants, comments should be limited to 5 minutes. However, speakers who submitted a late speaker card may be limited to a shorter time period if necessary. So if we do get additional cards. We encourage speakers to be as efficient as possible with their comments and request that speakers do not reiterate comments previously made by others. We do have some limited time today, so we want to make sure that we're able to get to everyone in their comments. So our first speaker is going to be Dan Nomolini Jr. with the Central Delta Water Agency. Once staff have unmuted you, you can begin.
Okay, can you folks hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm calling from my cell phone. I got to get caught up to speed technologically, but in any event, my name is Dan Nomolini Jr. I'm an attorney for the Central Delta Water Agency, and I want to thank you for this opportunity. I'm going to try to be really quick. I wanted to focus on and highlight one glaring problem with how this methodology handles the actual legal delta. I have a slide that I want to refer to, and I'll go over that in a few minutes. But the problem is the failure to recognize that the legal delta is a tidal estuary. The legal delta is not a river. It's not like a river in the foothills or the mountains where water comes from one direction, comes from uphill and flows downhill. As a tidal estuary, the delta is unique and receives natural flow from 2 general directions. It receives it from the east. That would be the water coming down the watershed from the rivers into the delta. But there's a tremendous amount of natural flow that also comes in from the west. And that's the water flowing into the delta from the ocean and the bay. And I tried my best to look through all the materials, and I was able to confirm, to my satisfaction, that your proposed methodology does indeed entirely ignore this natural tidal flow from the west. And that's a big problem, as I'll explain. But now if I could refer you to the slide, I want to just ignore all the writing for now, but I would be humbled and honored if some powers that be could take a look at this slide after the meeting. I think you'll be just as concerned as I am about this topic. So just to go over this quickly, this slide is showing the flows in and out of the delta. Those big giant arrows, those gray arrows in the left side of the map are showing the typical inflow in a single day, a single summer day. So typically we have on the order of 330,000 CFS coming into the delta naturally each day. Now you compare that to what's coming into the delta from the Sacramento and San Joaquin River. Up there I have a Sacramento River little box. This was as of a couple of days ago, May 17th. The inflow coming in from the Sacramento River was only 8,221 CFS. And going down the San Joaquin River at the bottom at Vernalis a few days ago, it was 1,032 CFS. So if you add those two together, the 1,032 to the 8, you end up with about 9,253 CFS coming into the delta from these watersheds. Now you compare that to the 330,000 CFS coming in from the west, and you realize that there is a major problem to ignore such a large amount of natural flow coming into the delta. And just again, to go over quickly, the 2 major problems with this, as far as your methodology, the 2 major problems of ignoring this tidal flow is, first, you will be wrongfully curtailing post-1914 water right holders within the delta tidal zone. You will be curtailing them on the basis that there is no available natural flow, when in fact, in reality and in law, there's an overwhelming amount of natural flow. The second problem is this not only affects the people in the Delta, but it affects everybody upstream. Because what your methodology is doing is you're assuming that the upstream diverters need to be curtailed so that sufficient natural flow flows into the Delta from the Sacramento and San Joaquin watersheds in order to meet the natural flow demand of the Delta's senior water right holders, etc. But that is patently false. The natural flow is abundant. It's so abundant that we in the Delta are under the constant threat of being flooded. You know, we have the luxury of having too much water, but it's also very challenging. It's a negative as well. But your methodology is hurting not only the Delta, but all upstream diverters. And so I have a request down at the bottom of this slide. I'm just going to read it. It says, please include these natural tidal flows in your water unavailability methodology. Or if you continue to exclude them, please be transparent and thoroughly explain the legal basis for excluding them so that stakeholders have an opportunity to examine and comment on that basis. From what I could tell, there is not even a sentence in the current methodology even recognizing this overwhelming amount of natural flow, much less is there any explanation of why it's being excluded. So if the powers that be could take some interest in this and help get this straightened out, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We will be sure to address that issue in the report. I think, and perhaps your comment letter, any written comments that you submit could address the issue of the quality of the water coming in from the ocean and whether that would be appropriate for use for agricultural or municipal purposes.
Yes, thank you. We will be submitting written comments. I appreciate that.
All right, thank you. So I think next up we have Brett Baker.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go right ahead.
All right, excellent. Thank you again for convening this. I think it's a very important discussion to have. I'd like to reiterate some of Mr. Guy's comments that it'd be a more fruitful discussion, I believe, if we had these conversations in wet years or years when we weren't under the hammer, so to speak, and scrambling to try and find solutions to short-term solutions to longer-term problems. So again, I just want to iterate that I'm coming from the same perspective as my colleague who previously commented, a diverter as a diverter or diverters in the tidal estuary that is the Delta. I just wanted to get some clarity. It's great to be commenting first, but usually we like to bat last here. And I think that's kind of where we end up coming from as riparian claimants and senior claimants in that tidal estuary. So in the draft, section 3.2, where you talk about water quality and public trust resources, I'm delighted to see that you are pursuing these curtailments, to make water available for senior water right holders and claimants. I just would like to know if there is anyone downstream of us in the Central Delta or folks diverting from that tidal zone in the Delta that you're curtailing or would be pursuing curtailment for, that would be senior to some of those claims that have availability of that natural flow. And then also, I'm curious to know how transfers will be accounted for or effectuated under these scenarios. We commented on a series of transfers last year. There's a few more in front of the board currently. I believe they're appropriate of users transferring water via groundwater substitution. So we're going to submit written comments on those as well, but I'm just very curious to know, understanding that transfers are a critical tool in the toolbox, how they will be accounted for and how the basis for those upstream appropriative holders may or may not be curtailed later in the fall if there's no water available here in the Delta. So anyhow, those are my comments, and I would appreciate any kind of feedback or follow-up as it's warranted.
Sure, I can go ahead and respond quickly and briefly to a couple of the topics that you raised. I think you're asking about curtailments to meet senior users downstream. The methodology is managing down to a flow of 0. I think there isn't any provisions for providing flow for public trust resources or salinity control. All the salinity control water that is accounted for in the methodology is essentially previously stored water by the project. So the methodology is both intended to protect that previously stored water as well as identifying when water is unavailable down to 0. I think you're maybe bringing up a geographical issue with that issue. And, that's something that we can take a further look at, but it is, we don't have the ability to evaluate water availability by individual diverter at this point in time. That might be something that would be available in the future. Again, this analysis is looking at post-1914 users. I think for that purpose, there's a good amount of information to indicate that there isn't water available for those post-14 users, and there isn't water available likely for a number of pre-14 users for a large portion of the summer time period. But we can ensure that we address those issues with a little more clarity in the report. In terms of water transfers, to the extent that water transfers are being made available by releasing previously stored water, those are not accounted for in the methodology. The methodology is directed at evaluating water unavailability of natural and abandoned flows, not transfers. So those are not accounted for. To the extent a water user is curtailed under a right that they plan to transfer, that transfer would not be able to occur. To the extent, again, that it's previously stored water, then that transfer could occur because it's, again, not part of the water unavailability methodology.
Okay, if I might ask one follow-up, you mentioned salinity control. Is there flexibility in the model to incorporate changes in salinity requirements like TUCP is before the board now currently?
The methodology is agnostic to those issues. It's not evaluating how much water is needed for salinity control. It's managing down to a supply of 0. It's not providing. There are no provisions for a minimum flow, natural and abandoned flow that would be needed to meet salinity requirements in the Delta. That is all assumed to be being provided by previously stored water, which is not available for diversion. So that, if there is not natural and abandoned flow available in the watershed, then that's essentially what the analysis is looking at. It's not looking at water needed for salinity control, but the analysis is also intended to protect previously stored water because, again, the water may be available in the stream system and it may be of an adequate quality, but it is not available for diversion given that it is previously stored water being released by the Department of Water Resources and the Bureau of Reclamation for the purposes of repelling salinity from entering the Delta and not for the purposes of serving other water users. So I think we touch upon those issues in the report. We'll circle back to them and make sure that we address them. And if you have additional comments that you think we need to consider, please provide those in writing, and we'll be sure to take a look at them and address them as appropriate.
All right, we'll move on to our next speaker, which is John Herrick.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go right ahead.
Thank you. John Herrick for South Delta Water Agency. I'll echo some of the other comments that have been made already, but first I want to congratulate staff. I think generally the approach has been pretty good. There were a number of issues that arose in the last drought about the methodology And it would be very helpful if we could be told how those were addressed or corrected. It appears that one of them, which was demand in an upstream watershed being applied to downstream supplies, it looks like that's been cured, but it'd be nice to see, if possible, just a short list of what was wrong before and how it's been corrected. I do want to echo again the issue of the timing on this. Again, I think staff's done a good job, but it looks like, it looks like we've ended up in the same place we were last time, which is very late in the process. The public is allowed to comment and go over this stuff. We'd hope that after the last drought, and we're assured that the parties, especially the ones to the curtailment proceeding, would be involved in the development of the new criteria, and we weren't. So we wish that would, we'd like a little more interaction with the parties. Lastly, I'd just like to add, we'll be submitting comments on all these issues, but lastly, I'd like to add there's a few nuances to the issue of stored water releases being protected. And that is Water Code Section 12200 at SEC goes through the obligations, some obligations of the projects, and mandates that they make releases or coordinate releases to the maximum extent possible to meet the objectives of that section. And those objectives, are water quality maintenance, superior rights, but also a supply. So the Racanelli decision interpreted those sections and confirmed that exports are dependent upon those three things occurring first, which would suggest then that stored water that's released for some purposes is not protected, but is available to meet the statutory obligations of the projects. There are a lot of other issues. We'll submit written comments. Thank you very much for the time. And I unfortunately have to leave and can't listen to anybody else. Sorry.
All right, thank you very much, John. Let's see, so let's move on to Valerie Kincaid.
Hi, this is Valerie Kincaid. Can you hear me?
Yes, go right ahead, Valerie.
Great. Video. This is Valerie Kincaid with the San Joaquin Tributaries Authority. A few comments. First, I want to say thanks to the State Water Board staff. I know we've been working with you on the long-term drought preparedness and also, sorry, I'm going to stop the video. It's pixelated. And also on some of the methodology, and we appreciate the hard work. We understand the watershed, sub-watershed improvements that have been made, and we think that that's a big step forward. And we also really appreciate the commitment to following water right priority that is reflected in the report. Much like Mark Van Camp, we think that there's been a lot of really good work and there is some work left to do. So I'm going to go through some of that. I'm going to have short technical issues on supply and demand, a quick note on legal issues, and then kind of next steps in moving forward from the SGT perspective. So on the demand, our understanding is that the methodology primarily uses 2018 demand, which obviously is 3-year-old data coming off of a very wet year, 2017. And during that year, reporting rates were fairly low at 57%. And that's just to note that this information on demand may be sufficient to estimate availability notices, but we don't think it's sufficient to support an actual curtailment action, whether that's an order or a regulation. The methodology regarding statements of diversion and use that mark both pre-14 and riparian rights, the methodology is not very clear on how those are treated. I know that the quality control went through and tried to take out double reporting of those, but it's unclear as to whether those are treated as riparian or pre-14 rights or both. And certainly that will have to be fixed or disclosed prior to any curtailment. That was an issue that came up previous years, and it certainly does change both the order of priority and downstream kind of senior determination. The methodology also doesn't account for drought actions and resulting reductions in demand. Several of our members take drought actions locally to reduce demand, as do many people in the system. And the methodology doesn't really have a way to consider that or look at that or estimate it. And we think kind of tipping the hat at maybe some Sigma practices, looking at local control and local operations would be helpful. And letting some of the locals share with you how they operate their system successfully. Settlement contractor demand, the methodology for demand does include the previous or senior demand from Sac River settlement contractors, but not Friant. And I know that the methodology thinks that that's offset by automatically putting the later contract demand as a lower priority, but that does technically double count that water, and we would like to kind of have a little bit more disclosure and explain how that affects the methodology. And then finally, on my last point on the demand issue is that the watershed specific analysis is, again, very helpful, and we appreciate that. One of the explanations today was interesting. It's this concept that once riparian and pre-14 demand on an upper watershed outweighs the supply, that those watersheds are considered disconnected from the system and kind of taken out. And we think that's probably appropriate, but I'm unclear about whether that means curtailment is off the table for those upstream watersheds. I assume if there's no more full natural flow, and the demand is met and it's taken off the system, then curtailment would not happen. I don't know if that's the case or the correct assumption to make from that information, but probably more information on how it's disconnected and if those disconnections evaluate the downstream claimed demand in the Delta. So those are the comments, and I think some clarifications on the demand side. Similarly, on the supply side, the methodology estimates supply primarily using that B120 Bulletin 120 DWR tool, and that, as we heard from the DWR rep, estimates snowpack measurements, water content, expected weather, rates of evaporation, ground absorption, and other factors. And I think we've heard both from Tuesday's drought update meeting and then today, the DWR presentation today, that tool, really had a hard time or struggled in a year like this, where those things were very difficult to predict. So because the supply is based largely on that forecast and not actual measurements, these are, theoretical estimates. Those, from my understanding, the methodology has all of those gauges, but the gauges are not actual measurements. They're theoretical estimates derived from the forecasting that DWR presented, and that these estimates are on a monthly scale. And usually that monthly scale goes from February to May. Given these restrictions, again, this methodology may be sufficient for water availability notices, but certainly we don't think it's precise enough to support a curtailment, either order or regulation coming out. Also on supply, the methodology estimates return flows on the San Joaquin system. That's the use of calcium 3 and how that method was used and how calcium 3 was applied is not disclosed. We'd like to probably see a little bit more of that. And my understanding is the methodology also does not estimate return flows for upper watersheds, but it just does it for the lower watersheds. So we're wondering why that is and if you can improve that. And then finally, the methodology and treatment of abandoned flows seems fairly unclear. The approach seems to be to protect stored water until it meets a compliance point. But we would request that the methodology explain what exactly that means and if there is a different demand set past a compliance point that would have additional supply because of that, whereas the diverters upstream of that compliance point may not have the same availability. It does not appear that the methodology parses that out and is consistent with the treatment of abandoned flows. So those are the supply issues that I think we have. And again, I think these are big picture items, and I think that the existing methodology may support, a concept of availability, but I think, as everyone knows, the next step to actually curtail or do a regulation curtailing simply would require a lot more information and data at a more precise level. I'll touch really quickly on the legal issues and then talk about next steps. Some of the legal issues are pretty obvious, and they have not changed from the 2014-2015 drought. I do note that the report refers to potential future curtailment of pre-14 water right holders, which is, again, outside the State Water Board's jurisdiction. So we would like the methodology to be careful and potentially remove that reference. Second, the methodology is premised upon a lot of foundational legal determinations, which would require a hearing, potentially a system-wide adjudication. And those, that hasn't happened. And I think everyone understands that. But I just want to be clear that those assumptions the fight about those legal assumptions have not been made, and the assumptions are embedded in the methodology. I'll run through very quickly some of them, but you've heard some of them today. The concept of this ocean flow concept is one of those. Unverified demand and statements of diversion and use. The assumption that all of that demand is valid is, of course, a large legal assumption that has not been determined. The connection of all diversions in the Delta to all upstream supply. We appreciate, again, the watershed parsing out, but that assumption that every Delta demand could take water from the SAC and San Joaquin systems, that would need to be much more precise and decided. And there's an issue of prescriptive rights. Several cases at least favor some prescription claims on the San Joaquin. Meridian and Lux are two that respectively talk about the Tuolumne and the Stanislaus having prescriptive claims, and that's not in the mix. Finally, the report states that the methodology can be refined to support orders. We do request what refining actions would need to be taken. I guess from our perspective, there would be some major lifts and need a significant more amount of data in order to transition to that step. And speaking of next steps, we very much obviously appreciate working with the State Water Board. We will continue to do that. Two things moving forward. One is that in working with the board, we want to continue to kind of define the problem. Part of the presentation today talked about the falling full natural flow and this monthly step. If we're going to see that the full natural flow is largely gone by June, then really the problem becomes protection of stored water. And that problem would need a totally different solution. So I guess I've said this before in drought preparedness, defining our problem and our solutions are really important. We'll continue to work with the State Water Board on that. If we have the problem of protecting stored water, the answer doesn't necessarily need to be a system-wide curtailment. You can have a much narrower and much more precise resolution or to that problem. So I guess that's the question. We would like to look at estimates of full natural flow. If they are not in the system, maybe a system-wide curtailment is not actually something we need to do this year. So scaling our solutions to our problems is something we want to continue to work on. And then the second point is the development of a curtailment regulation. We are hopeful. We've heard that referred to both in this staff presentation and also in the State Water Board meeting on Tuesday, and the drought element that came up. We're interested in talking more about that, what that looks like, the timing, the geographic outreach, the basis, the legal basis upon which the regulation would be developed. So we certainly would like to have a lot more detail and a lot more conversation with staff about that and about the development of that if that is the next step for the State Water Board. So with that, we appreciate it. And again, we'll continue to work with staff and board members as we move through this difficult time. And I appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thanks, Valerie. We appreciate your comments, and there's a lot there, so I don't think I'm going to attempt to respond to all of that. Now, I guess what would be really helpful is where you have proposed improvements upon the methodology that you would suggest to identify those specifically, identify how much time and resources it would take to address those issues. You know, I think that's one of the major tensions that we're going to have this year, is that there are, of course, with more time and more resources and better information, there's a lot more that we could do. But given the constraints that exist this year, we'd be interested in hearing your feedback on that. Also, certainly hearing more about what you think a narrower approach might look like. I'm having a hard time envisioning that, so it would definitely be nice to hear your thoughts on that and get some of that in your written comments.
Sure. I know it was a lot. I appreciate it. We'll definitely submit written comments, and yeah, I agree. If we all had more time and had a system adjudication in place, it'd be easier to do. But we will submit comments and certainly provide suggestions on kind of the more narrowed solution approach. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Next up, we have Jennifer Spalletta.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to provide comments today. First, I wanted to thank staff for putting together a good written report and just acknowledge that at this point in time, we are miles ahead of where we were in 2015 as far as understanding staff's methodology and the steps that went into it and your data sources. And it's greatly appreciated, because it means that your commenters today, as you have seen, are more or less all in agreement with the next steps and how things can be further refined. And we're talking about the important issues as opposed to asking questions about how the state board came up with the decision that it's reached. So I think that's to be appreciated by everyone. The second thing I wanted to comment on is that we should all recognize that this unavailability methodology is just a tool, and it does have some benefits, but it also has limitations. And whenever the state board is going to be using that tool to make decisions, particularly on curtailment, it needs to recognize the limitations of the tool. Right now, one of the main limitations is that it is using past data on demand. And I think it's very important that staff and the board work on refining this tool to include current data. This is something that Valerie mentioned, and I think a few others have mentioned as well. Under SB 88, there are more accurate sources of data on demand for permits and licensees. They have already reported for 2020. There are some diverters who are supposed to be reporting measured data instantaneously, and that data should be incorporated into the analysis, at least for the largest diverters. And I would recommend that be done prior to any decisions on curtailment. The second major issue I wanted to address relates to how to treat the water supply in the Delta. This has been mentioned by several prior commenters. The Delta does not work like a stream affected by gravity. It is a pool. There is the concept of residence time. There is a residual supply of water that moves back and forth in the Delta and the Bay, as Dante Namalini Jr. described. The current tool that you have in front of you does not take into account the Delta hydrodynamics. And so one of the challenges we have is how to make water availability determinations in a place that doesn't behave like the rest of the system and has different supplies of water that your methodology doesn't account for. So I actually thought that the graphic that the state water contractors put up was particularly useful to drive home this point. They, of course, agree that the Delta continues to be full of water, even if you don't have releases of stored water coming into the Delta. The difference, of course, is just the quality of the water that's there at the different diversion points. So I would just caution staff and the board that if you're going to be using this methodology to make any type of curtailment decision, even for post-1914 rights in the Delta, that you're very careful As I sit here today, I don't think you have in front of you sufficient facts to support a finding that there is an unavailability of water in a delta channel for a post-1914 diverter. You would have to make a different type of finding based on evidence relating to quality or some other reason that is not currently in your record, in your methodology, or as a result of today's workshop. And so that's the caution I would throw out today, is just recognize the limitations of your current tool. But along those same lines, just a positive note, I think there is room to discuss solutions to the problem of protecting stored water and how to deal with the Delta in a difficult time like this. And we need to really talk about whether curtailing those water rights in the Delta effectuates the goal of protecting stored water. And I think Tim mentioned this as well. There may be some other actions you can take that do a better job of getting toward the goal of protecting stored water. But at a minimum, I think you should be encouraged to look at whether curtailing the few post-1914 rights in the Delta pool is actually going to move you closer to your goal or not before you take that action. I certainly have appreciated the time that the Delta Water Master and frankly representatives of state water contractors and others have spent over the last few years just talking creatively about cooperative solutions to addressing this problem that don't necessarily involve curtailment, but maybe a more voluntary or contractual solution. And I know many of us are very interested in pursuing that, and we're certainly ready and willing to continue that conversation. The last point I wanted to make is that there was some reference in staff's report about the fact that this was a limited methodology regarding water availability or unavailability, and it did not attempt to look at issues of public trust or waste and unreasonable use. And I think that was a wise decision by staff to keep those issues separate. They are separate. And this tool should only be used to look at pure water unavailability. Finally, my recommendation to you, which is not immediate, is that if this is a tool that the state board wants to use, it's a tool that should be developed to use every month of every year, not just in drought times. So the more that we work with this tool and refine it and become familiar with it in every month of every year, I think the more confidence the regulated community is going to have in the state board's use of the tool, and frankly, more trust in how the tool is used. So those are my comments today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Jennifer. I think Eric Ekdahl, the chief of the Division of Water Rights, was going to respond related to some of the reporting issues. I think it would be helpful for all of those listening to hear some of the information about the challenges that we face with that information.
Hi, yeah, this is Eric. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Can people hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. I did want to note or briefly talk about the challenges we do have with a more up-to-date kind of set of demand data. After the last drought, or during the midst of the last drought, there was legislation passed called SB 88 or Senate Bill 88 that required metering and measurement and submittal of that metering and measurement data to the board. The intent of that data in part is to directly answer that question, try to get a more real-time understanding of water demands in the system. Or if we can't get a more real-time understanding, at least a higher resolution understanding, as opposed to kind of a monthly time step. And the first sets of data were submitted to the board for the 2018 water year and 2019 water year. And what we're seeing is in general kind of massive non-compliance with that reporting requirement. I think the compliance rate for 2018 was about 18% statewide, and the compliance rate for 2019 was about 13% statewide. We've broken that out and we've looked at compliance rates of the larger diverters, the diverters that report more than 5,000 acre feet per year within the Delta itself. And compliance rate is definitely better there, but not complete by any means. The other issue that we're noting in that even if people do submit data to us, when you open up those files, they're often incomplete or blank or don't contain useful information. And so we think at the state level, compliance rate is less than 5%. And so that's going to require a bit of work on our end, but also on the diverters end to report that data to us and report it in a useful and understandable format. And we do plan on, kind of working on the procedures and just getting some templates online and on the website over the summer. At the same time, in maybe the next week or two, we do plan on releasing a list of those that have not submitted anything to the board related to these SB 88 requirements. It's a pretty extensive list. And, if people find that they know folks on there that have reported and our list is in error, let us know. But also then it's a reminder for folks to just make sure that they're sending that information in to us, and it will help us, I think, create those more refined estimates that we do look forward to using on a month-by-month basis once the tool is more formally and fully fleshed out. So I think I'll hand it back there.
Great, thank you, Eric. All right, it looks like the next person on our list is Lauren Bernadette.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, go right ahead.
Great, thank you. My name is Lauren Bernadette with the Association of California Water Agencies, and we'd like to thank the board for its increased efforts, resources, and attention around this methodology. It clearly takes a large amount of work and staff resources, so we appreciate the board's commitment to this. We also appreciate the increase in communication, transparency, and involving stakeholders through this workshop format and through written comments. Repeating previous commenters, we also appreciate the board's commitment to the water rights priority system. Regarding section 3.1 on issuance of notices of water unavailability, we just request that any notices sent to water right holders are abundantly clear about what the notice means and what the water right holder is now expected to do. Is it a notice of expected water unavailability, or is water actually unavailable right now? The summary report says that notices are not directives to stop diverting, and it's important that that information also appears on the notices themselves. The notices should indicate next steps to expect, such as possible curtailment orders and what that means. Lack of clarity was an issue during the 2014-2015 drought, but this year will likely present an opportunity to be much clearer in those notices. Confusion helps no one in this fast-moving situation, so we recommend an abundance of clarity and transparency at all opportunities. That concludes my comments, and thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Great, thank you, Lauren. Okay, next up we have Nicholas Whips.
Hello, yes, this is Nicholas Whips, Deputy City Attorney, City County of San Francisco. I have no comment, just appreciate the opportunity to provide oral comments, and we probably will follow up with written comments by the deadline. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So next up we have Matt Moses.
Yeah, hi, Matt Moses, San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. A big thank you to staff. I see the amount of work that's gone into the report and materials that you've provided in today's workshop. I don't have any significant comments at this point. We'll probably provide something in writing soon. A couple things to echo that have already been mentioned, so I'll be quick. It would be valuable if staff can document changes that have been made to the methods that were used in 2014-15 and some of the rationale for those changes. That would help us all work through what we're doing now. And on the abandoned and return flows, more documentation would be helpful. I haven't fully digested the report and the worksheet that you sent out, but specifically on the return flows that are being pulled from Calcium 3, it would be valuable if you can document those fully, including their spatial representation. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Matt. So it looks like our next two speakers are not in the room yet. So we're going to move on to Jeff Kearns.
Okay, can you hear me, Jessica?
Yes, I can. Go right ahead, Jeff.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, there's been a lot of data thrown out here that that I was going to go over, and I just want to say that I agree with the other speakers who are asking for no curtailment on the San Joaquin River Basin. Just to give you a real life scenario here, we're a very small company. Our diversion right is for 106 acre feet, and I know that's not very much in the grand scheme of things, but it's everything to us. We supply 538 customers. A lot of them are retirees on fixed incomes. We're in between the 5,000 and 6,000 foot elevation up on the western slope up here in the Sierras. We're already imposing cuts beyond what we required in 14 and 15, and our customers are responding to that because they get it. Our geographic area, as such, does not allow us to be able to accept water transfers or any other kinds of purchases. So this water right is truly everything to us. We can get our usage down to 50, maybe even 60% of what our right allows us to, and I think we will hit that goal. Again, we agree with the other speakers about asking for no curtailment on the San Joaquin River Basin, and we want to thank you for putting on this workshop today. That's it. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jeff. Next up, we have George Hartman.
I'm here, thank you.
Great.
Let me get my video on. Okay, well, thank you for this opportunity. A little background, my grandfather purchased McDonald Island in the Delta in 1906, and our family has been farming continuously out there since then. I've been in water law for I'm 3 years short of 50. And so while I appreciate very much all the hard work that your group and the Delta Water Master have put into refining your strategies for curtailment or rationing of water in lean times like this, I have three major points I want to make. And I want to incorporate by reference most of the comments of Dante Nomalini Jr., Jennifer Spalletta, John Herrick. My first point is, I think great effort has been put into refining your tools and developing strategies for rationing water. The problem with that is equal effort has not been put into preparing for the next drought. In 2015, we had, and the years prior, we had severe drought. You would think that more effort would have been put into developing real world methodologies to provide greater water supply, including groundwater banking and similar strategies. But I don't see it. So while I think your work has been good, and I don't criticize the effort, I do criticize the lack of equal or greater effort to deal with the realities of drought. Had it been done in 2015, we might be in a different place now, but we definitely should be doing it for the future. That's my first point. My second point is, as others have said, your strategies and models may be applicable to non-tidal tributaries to the Delta. But there's a big black hole in all those strategies when it comes to the Delta. The first is the tidal action, which several speakers have addressed. The second is that you can curtail all of the delta. You can argue, as the state water contractors and others have been arguing for many years, that there is no natural flow, which isn't true because of tidal action. But the big problem you have, and that we have, is that you can't stop the delta from diverting water from any source. On McDonald Island, and I'll speak only to McDonald Island, but I believe this is true for all deeper delta islands. As a result of seepage, underground springs, and rainfall, we return by way of discharge pumps more water than we divert for crops. And it costs McDonald Island roughly $400,000 a year in electricity costs to do that. And so we are actually putting back into the system more than we take out. This alone makes the measurement of diversion in the delta just silly. And we can't stop it unless you're prepared to spend billions to build concrete levees around these islands. We can't stop the diversion. The other sub-point in this is that weeds use more water than crops. I think that's absolute fact, as established by multiple DWR and other studies. So irrigating crops will use less water than stopping farming and allowing water to come into the island and not spending the money to pump it out. You will end up losing more water that way through increased evapotranspiration. As it is, the only water the delta uses is what the plants and surface waters evapotranspirate. That's it. And if you want the delta to stop growing food, you'll actually lose water. The islands will fill, more weeds will grow, and eventually those islands will become lakes like Frank's Tract, as an example. So that's my second point. My third point is, I think it's unfortunate that many of the people who work at the state level on these kinds of projects and models and forecasting and water use really don't know how the delta works. And the state water master, I think, could give you a great presentation on that. It's taken him some years, but he has a firm grasp and understanding of how the delta works. And I think it would be helpful for staff and others involved in this process to, if you haven't been to the delta, if you haven't seen how it works, to accept my invitation, which is, we will happily entertain on McDonald Island anybody from your process that has a sincere interest in learning how the delta works. We will show you massive discharge pumps and incredible return flows. We will show you how levees seep and try to help you understand why the delta is an entirely different animal. Measuring diversion in the delta is meaningless. And I think you will understand that point if you'll take me up on my offer. Thank you very much. Any criticism I've offered is not personal. It is aimed at improving the process.
All right, thank you, George. Looks like our next speaker's not in the room, so we're going to move on to Jean Zaletsy. Jean, are you with us?
Thank you.
Great.
Jean Zaletsy, supplying comments on behalf of Bannock-Carbona Irrigation District, Patterson Irrigation District, and West Stanislaus Irrigation District. And thank you for the opportunity to comment on the revised methodology. We appreciate the effort that staff has put into this and acknowledge that there are improvements that have been made and the dedication of staff time. I will note, however, very similar to prior comment makers, that the methodology is still insufficient to curtail water right holders on a watershed, tributary, or diversion point specified location. There are still deficiencies in the data that would prevent an accurate determination of either water availability or water demand. Many of those have been mentioned already, and I won't repeat them. And we will provide more specific details in our comments. But for example, on the San Joaquin, it does not appear that you removed riparian from demand, even though there is no natural flow available. We also don't understand the extremely high project demand listed on the San Joaquin River. There doesn't seem to be an explanation for that. Again, as has been mentioned, the methodology is based upon 2018 data. And while we understand this may be the best available data, it is not sufficient data. Although 2018 was drier, water usage was still higher than it is to date. And just generally, water use reporting data is not sufficient to calculate realistic demand. There is an inherent tension between water use reporting, which water users see as essential to maintain their water right, and actual use, which is what an accurate demand management must be based on. So we'll continue to work with the state through our comments and through additional meetings to refine the methodology, but it's simply not there yet. And we've heard a lot today about the time constraints and how this is urgent, but with all due respect, and this is not intended to staff that's working on this here, the urgency is of the state board's own making. We've had 6 years or more to work on this methodology, but that hasn't been done. The decision makers at the state board did not heed the lessons of 2015 and work on the methodology as a priority over the past 6 years, which water users have urged. Rather, they looked away in 2015, and only when it got dry did their focus turn back to this methodology. And although there have been improvements, it's simply too little too late. We know how hard staff has worked. We also know that the state board is understaffed and underfunded. But the methodology upon which curtailment is based is far too important to raise any questions on accuracy. You determine the livelihood of real people when these determinations are made, and there's no room for unreasonable error. We know you're considering curtailments for post-1914 water users in the Bay Delta as early as June. We agree with prior speakers that such curtailments are not necessary on the San Joaquin River. We would urge you to consider a separate water availability determination for that portion of the San Joaquin River, at least where no project releases are made, as there is no indication of unavailability for users in that very large stretch of the river. And finally, I would repeat the refrain that we made in 2015. The state board simply does not have a duty to use taxpayer dollars in an attempt to protect the projects. The projects are just another water user, and if they believe their right is being infringed, they can file a complaint and have it investigated, as they did in 2015. And the issues are not as clear-cut as that you're simply trying to protect stored water being released for Bay Delta, as has been explained by the Delta users. And as we explained in 2015, it is much more complicated, the obligations that the projects have to release water. And all of that water is not necessarily protected from every diversion point in the Bay Delta watershed. So we will submit our written comments, and I appreciate the time that you're giving us to make comments today. Thank you.
Thanks. Maybe I can just add quickly. I think maybe you're making an argument that on the San Joaquin at least, that curtailments maybe aren't appropriate this year. I guess to the extent that I know we're getting a lot of comments on particular issues, to the extent that parties, I want to remind you again, have recommendations for what we can do this year. I recognize the concerns with the long-term planning issues, and I think we certainly acknowledge all of those concerns and take them very seriously. But in terms of the very serious water supply shortages that we're facing this year, we would be very interested in specific recommendations to address any issues that parties have raised, because you know, we are in a situation where this is something we need to look at. We have limited amounts of time. We have limited data. We have limited tools to do that work. So we would be very appreciative of very specific recommendations that will help us to do that.
All right, so let's move on to Alexis Stevens.
Hi, I don't have any additional comments other than those that have already been raised.
All right, thank you, Alexis. How about Robert Donlin?
Thanks, Ms. Bean. I too have no further comments that haven't been covered by prior speakers. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Robert. Justin Fredrickson?
Yes, ma'am. Good morning. My name is Justin Fredrickson with the California Farm Bureau, and I think I would echo a lot of what's been said. First, starting off with kudos in general for this effort. I think that's been pretty much unanimous, and I think one of the most important improvements is the improvement in transparency. And although it would be, in a perfect world, we would have been more focused on this every year since the last drought, whereas again, it feels like a little bit of a crunch as we're now into a drought. This does feel more transparent and more interactive and collaborative than 2014, 2015, and that's an excellent thing. I think that the technical expertise and the legal expertise and the local expertise that's brought to the table when you take that kind of approach leads to better tools and better decision making all around, and that's a good thing. One thing that really looms large for me what's happening is this mysterious scary thing of the close to 1 million acre feet disappearing overnight into the ground, and that not being accounted for using the tools that we've had to date. And so obviously going forward, we're going to need to figure out better what the role of dry soils are. Fire, perhaps. I'm thinking maybe the fire baked the ground and then it just became a giant sponge and sucked it up before it ever got to the reservoirs. But to the extent all of that plays into all of your demand and supply projections, we need to figure it out. And then, and I don't think it's going to be pretty. We need to know the answers though, so that we can figure out how we're going to operate and adapt this system. It's really important. On SB 88, I think there's also a lot of the demand projections are based on information where there are compliance issues or data quality issues, timing issues, time lag issues. And all of that needs to be worked through. But I think there are other things that can supplement some of that information, like more of a watershed level look as a back check to those things, not so much of a hard, paper reporting approach. Things like ET, remote sensing, and improving our system of gauges, all of that is going to help. And then things like what we've seen in the Delta, everybody talks about the Delta as a unique place. Well, the Delta Water Master was again helpful working through what I believe they have in place now, which is an alternative measuring method based on remote sensing. And I think that kind of thing can be really important going forward. Whereas, chasing the paper and trying to, perfect this reporting, I don't know that that's ever going to give us a complete, picture that we need. And then in terms of you hear all these valid points on all sides, but there's at the same time we're working toward a better system. I think we're going to get there if we continue with this kind of approach. But at the end of the day, there is no perfect system. There never has been. And what we need are workable arrangements. In reality, that's what we've always had. But some of the old arrangements, it looks like they're breaking under the stresses of what we've been seeing the last few years. And so we need to get a handle on how we're going to operate the system and what can actually work. And that's where some of the things that were mentioned, I think I agree with and could be very helpful. Things like contracts and agreements, sort of water user initiated, similar to what Mr. O'Laughlin was describing on the San Joaquin side. And then in working in collaboration with the board to get to something that actually works, because we're in an emergency. All of us are just trying to get through this kind of year. Also, targeted solutions were mentioned. I think that's a good thought. And then voluntary agreements, whether that's demand reduction or voluntary or forbearance, some type of an agreement among water rights holders. I think all of that can be helpful. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Justin. And now we have John Rubin.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to speak at today's workshop. I did want to thank the State Water Board and State Water Board staff for holding the workshop, and appreciate all of the work that staff has put into the methodology. Appreciate the attention that the board members specifically are paying to this effort. Given the conditions this year, agencies are doing their best to move water to areas of need to address the impacts of the severe drought that we're suffering from. Agencies across the state have come together and are finding solutions that allow for the most efficient use of the small amount of water that is available in the system. The State Water Board is obviously one of those agencies. During drought, the State Water Board has the important role, among others, of informing water right holders if water is available to support appropriations under their rights. The State Water Board must undertake that role in a manner consistent with the water right priorities. Westlands does believe that the methodology that's being prepared by the State Water Board staff does help advance this important role of the State Water Board, and the methodology does reflect significant progress since this issue was addressed in 2014 and 2015. However, in years like this, determining whether water is available is not as simple as focusing on those often characterized as the most junior water right holders in the system. It's critically important for the State Water Board to consider availability for post-14 water rights, pre-14 water rights, and riparian water right holders. As some of the discussions earlier today have highlighted, the comprehensive approach is necessary, at least in part because of the complexities of the system, that in years like this, much and sometimes all of the water flowing into the delta from a particular water body is non-native. This year, Westlands is very concerned with the potential unauthorized diversion of Central Valley Project water. It would be very frustrating if hundreds, if not thousands, of cubic feet per second of water were diverted without authorization, particularly if those unauthorized diversions occur when Central Valley Project operations are regulated to the cubic foot per second. It would also be very frustrating if unauthorized diversions persist because of the impact they would have on Central Valley Project operations generally and Westlands specifically. Because of regulations imposed on the Central Valley Project, unauthorized diversions would place additional pressures on storage, impairing reclamation's ability to serve water, not just to people and farms, but to wildlife and to fish. Ms. Riddle and the state water contractors highlighted this point in their presentations. Unauthorized diversions could also impair the ability of the Central Valley Project to convey supplemental water to Westlands and others that acquired water through transfers. There will always be losses when supplemental water is conveyed through the delta. Often those losses are in 20–25% range. However, unauthorized diversions may increase that percent of loss. And this year, DWR is projecting losses in the range of 30 to 35%. I would note that Westlands alone has invested in excess of $100 million in supplemental supplies. Those supplies could be put to beneficial use by farmers in Westlands this summer. However, Westlands understands the benefit that the transfer water could provide to the aquatic environment, and therefore Westlands has supported a reasonable delay in the moving of some of the transfer water that it has acquired. Farmers do need water this summer to meet critical needs. Yet Westlands supports delaying delivery of a portion of the transfer water so that it can remain in Shasta Reservoir to improve the cold water pool and be available to the aquatic environment this fall. I would like to conclude by reflecting Westland's support for the State Water Board staff's efforts to develop the methodology to determine water unavailable in the Delta watershed, but would like to stress that the methodology must apply to post and pre-14 water rights as well as riparian water right holders. The comprehensive approach is needed to avoid further impact to the aquatic environment and to avoid further stress on the farmers and communities, including those that depend on Central Valley Project water. I thank you for the opportunity to present today. We are continuing to review the methodology, and will prepare written comments as we identify any further issues. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I believe that concludes our public comment section. I want to confirm that there aren't any other speakers. I know we skipped over a few people who were not in the meeting. All right, if we could go ahead and bring the staff slides back up and go to slide 35, please. Thank you. Okay, again, I would like to thank all of the presenters and speakers for participating in today's workshop. As previously mentioned, the recording of this workshop will be posted to our drought webpage. And that brings me to just kind of discussing a few ways that we can communicate with you on this process going forward. So we do have a drought webpage, waterboards.ca.gov/drought. So you can find information there. Specifically for information on the methodology, we have a drought tools and methods page that is linked from our primary page. The direct link is also included here on this slide. That would be the second bullet. We do encourage you to visit these pages and see what's available. There's other tools and methods that we'll be using to support our drought decision making. And then finally, if you're not already signed up, it's great if you can sign up for the drought updates email subscription list. That is really the most effective way for us to get information out quickly. And we do plan on sending out updates regarding the methodology and other information on notices issued on water unavailability to this list. So there's a couple of ways you can sign up for that email subscription list. There's a box at the bottom of the drought page that will allow you to do that. You can also use the link that's provided here on this slide, which will take you to the board's general email subscription list, and you would just search for drought updates and select that to sign up. Next slide. So we just want to remind you that written comments on the draft methodology and the related resources discussed today must be submitted to the bay-delta@waterboards.ca.gov email by May 25th, 2021. Comments should be formatted with a heading description, a heading describing the general topic or subject of your comment. And where changes to the methodology are recommended, specific recommendations should be provided that can be implemented in the near term. That includes specific recommended data sources and the basis for any recommended changes. The board is also planning to hear an informational item on this at the June 1st board meeting. The notice and agenda for the June 1st board meeting will be available soon. Soon after that, the board anticipates issuing notices of water unavailability to all post-1914 appropriative users. And we will continue to communicate with and outreach to the public as we develop additional resources and take action. So again, we do encourage you to sign up for that drought updates email list and visit our Water Board's drought information and updates webpage for additional information and resources. So we appreciate your time and interest in this matter, and we want to thank you very much for participating in the workshop today, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.